morning fog clung stubbornly to the cobbled streets of St. Albans, muting the town's familiar colours into a palette of grey and silver. Through the dense mist, the silhouette of Blackwood Manor loomed, a stately home of red brick and ivy-choked stone, the kind of place that seemed immune to the passing of time. Yet, despite its outward calm, the manor held a secret so disquieting that even its long-serving staff had begun to whisper, cautiously, behind closed doors. Colonel Edwin Blackwood, retired officer of the British Army, had been found dead, his body sprawled across the library floor in a position that seemed both unnatural and deliberate. The room, a grand chamber lined with shelves of leather-bound tomes, heavy velvet curtains drawn tightly against the chill morning light, showed no signs of forced entry, no disturbance of furniture, and yet the colonel's demise was anything but ordinary. The local constable, Inspector Grayson, had arrived shortly after the household discovered the body. Grayson was a competent man, methodical and earnest, but he had never encountered a puzzle quite like this. Colonel Blackwood's death appeared simple at first glance, a heart attack perhaps, or a tragic accident. But the peculiar arrangement of objects on the desk demanded a second, sharper look. A single fountain pen, uncapped, lay beside an open journal, its ink smeared as though in the midst of a hurried note. A teacup, untouched but with a faint trace of liquid inside, sat at the edge of the table, a thin ring of condensation marring the polished wood. Yet what struck Grayson as most perplexing was a small envelope, sealed and addressed in the colonel's meticulous hand, but containing only a single playing card, the ace of spades. The presence of the card seemed absurd, almost theatrical. It suggested a game, a threat, a message, yet provided nothing concrete for the lawman to grasp. Grayson found himself circling the room repeatedly, hands in pockets, eyes scanning the library as if the walls themselves might offer a confession. The windows were locked from the inside, and the only door to the hallway showed no sign of tampering. The household staff, in their black mourning clothes, clustered nervously by the fireplace, whispering half-formed theories and glances of fear. No one had heard anything unusual the previous night, no arguments, no footsteps in the hallways, no indication that someone had breached the colonel's sanctuary. Miss Marple, who had been visiting the nearby village on an errand of her own, arrived later that morning, at the insistence of a mutual acquaintance. She was an unassuming figure, slight of frame, with a gentle face and eyes that hinted at a sharp, unyielding intelligence. The locals often underestimated her, mistaking her quiet demeanour for an absence of insight, a mistake they would later regret. She walked into the library with the calm assurance of someone accustomed to reading not just people, but the spaces they inhabited. Her gaze lingered on the colonel's body, on the peculiar card, and on the scattered personal effects, noting each with a meticulous care that made Grayson fidget slightly in his own inadequacy. "Curious, isn't it?" Grayson ventured almost apologetically. "Very," Miss Marple replied, her tone measured, unhurried. She bent to inspect the journal. The ink smear was irregular, not the smooth blot one would expect from a sudden collapse. Someone had paused mid-sentence. "It seems," she murmured more to herself than to anyone else, "that Colonel Blackwood was interrupted. But by what, and by whom, is less clear." She moved slowly around the room, her eyes sweeping over the shelves and the furniture. On the mantelpiece rested a collection of small mementos, a miniature regimental sword, a silver pocket watch, a photograph of the colonel in uniform, smiling beside a stern-looking officer. One object, a small brass key, caught her attention. It was oddly out of place, nestled beneath a stack of letters as though deliberately hidden, yet not enough to escape immediate notice. Miss Marple picked it up, turning it over in her hand, and her brow furrowed. She had the habit of noticing the minutiae that others disregarded, the subtle smudge of a fingerprint, the faint scent of tobacco in an otherwise undisturbed room, the way a curtain hung slightly askew. "Was there a will, Inspector?" she asked, straightening. "Yes," Grayson said, his voice tight. "But it was last updated 10 years ago. Colonel Blackwood's affairs are straightforward, at least on paper. He had no known enemies. At least, none that anyone is willing to admit to." Miss Marple nodded, though her eyes were already tracing invisible lines between the objects and the people who might have interacted with them. She crouched slightly to examine the floor near the desk, noting the absence of footprints, dust disturbances, anything that might indicate movement during the crucial hours. "And the household?" she asked casually. "How many live here?" "Only the maid, the cook, and a gardener," Grayson replied. "The rest are relatives, infrequent visitors. Everyone claims to have been asleep before midnight. We've spoken to each of them, but, well, you know how it is. People forget or choose not to remember what might incriminate them." Miss Marple's eyes rested on the playing card again. "The ace of spades," she said softly, more to herself than to Grayson. "A symbol of death in some circles, of luck in others. But why leave it in an envelope? And why this room?" She tapped a slender finger on the journal. "The message is deliberate, yet its meaning obscured." As the day wore on, Miss Marple moved among the staff and relatives, asking quiet, probing questions. Her questions seemed innocuous, almost banal, yet they revealed cracks in the polished facade of propriety. The maid, a timid girl named Clara, admitted to hearing a low, almost imperceptible scraping sound near the library door late the previous night, which she had dismissed as the wind. The cook, a stout woman with a penchant for tea and gossip, mentioned that the colonel had been unusually agitated the evening before, pacing the library and muttering under his breath. Even the gardener, a silent man who preferred the company of plants, revealed that he had seen a shadow moving across the upper terrace windows around the same hour. Each piece of information, minor as it seemed, began to form a pattern in Miss Marple's mind. The inconsistency of time, the deliberate placement of objects, the obscure clue of the playing card. It all hinted at someone intimately familiar with the household and the colonel's routines. Someone who knew precisely when and how to strike without leaving obvious traces. By late afternoon, the fog had lifted slightly, revealing the sprawling gardens and ivy-clad walls in sharper detail. Miss Marple stood near the library window, looking out as though the answer might lie beyond the manor itself. "Inspector," she said finally, "this was not a simple accident nor a crime of passion. The perpetrator is close, perhaps closer than anyone realizes. The question is why?" Grayson, feeling the weight of his own limitations, could only nod. The crime had seemed unsolvable from the moment he first entered the library, and yet, in the quiet, deliberate observations of Miss Marple, a thread of understanding began to emerge. He watched as she crouched once more by the desk, tracing her finger along the faint indentation in the blot of ink, a subtle clue that might have been dismissed by any other observer. Somewhere in the silence of Blackwood Manor, between the echoing footsteps and the whispers of the staff, lay the key to a puzzle that appeared impossible. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the polished floorboards. And still the mystery remained. A man dead in a locked room, a playing card as his only message, and a house full of people who all seemed to know more than they would admit. For Colonel Blackwood's silent funeral was not merely a commemoration of his life, but a prelude to revelations that would shake the quiet town to its core. Miss Marple, patient and perceptive, knew this. The threads were there, tangled though they might be, and it was only a matter of following them, carefully, quietly, until the truth revealed itself. Miss Marple spent the night at the village inn, her mind alive with quiet deliberation, the flickering candle on her bedside table casting shadows that seemed to echo the mysteries of Blackwood Manor. By early morning, the mist had thinned over the streets, revealing the familiar outlines of shop fronts and gardens, but the shroud of uncertainty still lingered in her thoughts. She returned to the manor with a sense of purpose, her small handbag containing nothing more than a notebook, a pair of spectacles, and the calm patience that had guided her through countless subtle investigations. The library greeted her once more with an air of solemnity. The body of Colonel Blackwood had been removed, leaving the room disturbingly empty, yet the evidence remained, carefully preserved by Inspector Grayson and his constables. The ace of spades had been placed in an evidence envelope, the inked journal carefully bagged, and the objects on the desk untouched. Grayson, standing by the fireplace with a frown of consternation, greeted her with a mixture of relief and frustration. "I confess, Miss Marple, I've been racking my brain all night. Nothing seems to make sense. It's as if the colonel simply vanished, leaving a card to mark his passing." Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and stepped closer to the desk, her gaze sweeping over the array of items with methodical precision. She picked up the fountain pen, noting the way the ink had spread unevenly across the page. "It seems rushed," she murmured, "but not in panic. There is deliberation here. Someone wanted this record to be found, yet obscured its meaning. Tell me, Inspector, was the pen placed neatly after the Colonel fell, or left in the natural position?" Grayson shook his head. "I would say naturally, but I cannot be certain. The staff say they found him exactly as we see the scene, but—" He trailed off, the weight of uncertainty heavy in his voice. Miss Marple knelt slightly to examine the floor, running her fingers lightly over the carpet edges, tracing faint marks. Her eyes caught a subtle discoloration near the fireplace, a small, almost imperceptible smudge of soot that seemed out of place on the otherwise pristine floor. She noted it carefully, making a small mark in her notebook. It suggested someone had crouched there briefly, perhaps retrieving or placing an object without disturbing the wider scene. Her attention shifted to the shelves lining the walls. She ran her finger along the spines of the books, noting a faint fingerprint on a leather-bound volume that should have been undisturbed. The print was small, deliberate, as if someone had sought a particular volume but replaced it carefully afterward. Miss Marple's lips pressed together. A clue, subtle though it was, hinted at premeditation. Whoever had been in this room had known precisely what they were doing, and yet had left a signature, the ace of spades, almost as a mocking confession. Grayson, sensing her focus, asked, "Do you think it is a message? A warning, perhaps?" "Perhaps," she replied softly, standing to pace slowly, eyes flicking to each corner of the room. "Or perhaps a misdirection. The real message lies not in the envelope, but in the manner in which the room has been arranged. There is intention in every placement." The household staff had been called in once more, gathered in the sitting room, under gentle questioning. Miss Marple moved among them quietly, offering small smiles and gestures of reassurance while listening intently. Clara, the maid, fidgeted nervously with her apron. When Miss Marple asked again about the previous night, Clara's eyes betrayed a flicker of hesitation. I thought I saw someone near the back staircase, ma'am," she admitted, "but I wasn't certain. It was dark, and I didn't think to mention it." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. A shadow moving along the staircase at such a late hour could indicate an intruder, or it could indicate someone familiar with the house's secret routines. She noted Clara's words carefully, filing them alongside the minor observations, the soot smudge, the fingerprint on the book, the ink smear. Each was insignificant alone, yet together they hinted at a pattern. She next turned her attention to the relatives, whose grief seemed polished and performative. A cousin, Mr. Philip Blackwood, stood stiffly near the window, eyes fixed on the gardens. Miss Marple approached him with gentle politeness. "Mr. Blackwood, how well do you know the Colonel's habits? Was there anything unusual about him in the last few days?" Philip's mouth tightened. Nothing unusual. He was in good spirits as always. A little more preoccupied than usual, perhaps, but that is nothing extraordinary." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. "And yet he spent hours in the library yesterday, did he not? Late into the evening?" Philip shifted uneasily. "Yes, but that was common. He often wrote letters or notes late at night." She gave no response, only made a small note in her notebook, observing a telltale flush rising across his ears. It was subtle, easily overlooked by anyone not attuned to human behaviour, but Miss Marple had long understood that such micro-expressions could reveal truths one might try to conceal. Her examination led her next to the back staircase, a narrow, dimly lit passage that seemed innocuous, but carried a certain architectural peculiarity. Miss Marple ran her hand along the banister, noting a faint smudge halfway up, another mark of human contact, recent enough to be significant. She stepped lightly on the stairs, noticing a slight creak on a particular tread that might betray repeated use. The evidence was small, almost dismissible, yet in her mind it formed a quiet, insistent thread. Someone had moved through this space with intention and familiarity, late at night, avoiding notice, leaving behind the faintest signs of passage. Returning to the main hall, she paused near the grand mirror, catching her reflection briefly before studying the subtle distortions of light across the polished floor. There was a sense, almost imperceptible, that the room itself had been used to stage something, its arrangement, the objects, even the shadows, orchestrated to create confusion. Miss Marple allowed herself a quiet, inward smile. The deception was elegant, layered, meant to mislead those who would rely solely on obvious evidence. She then turned her attention back to the ace of spades. Unlike Grayson, she did not see it merely as a symbol of death or superstition. There was something personal in the choice, a clue meaningful only to the sender and the recipient. She recalled a casual remark made by the Colonel the week before, a jest about his regiment's old playing card tradition, a private joke among officers. Could it be that the card was not a threat, but a signature, a calling card meant to be recognized by someone who understood its significance? Miss Marple spent the remainder of the morning walking carefully through the house, inspecting each hallway, examining minor disturbances in dust or light, cataloguing subtle inconsistencies in the stories she had been told. By mid-afternoon, she reconvened with Grayson in the library. "Inspector," she said, calm but certain, "the room tells a story that is invisible to most." The perpetrator was careful, yet not meticulous enough to avoid leaving small traces. The challenge lies in reading those traces correctly, and I believe we have our first sign of deception in plain sight. Grayson leaned forward, eager yet apprehensive. "Which sign?" Miss Marple gestured toward the desk. "The ink smear on the journal. It is deliberate yet interrupted. Someone wanted the Colonel's writing to be discovered mid-thought, but not completed. The placement of the card, the position of the pen, even the soot smudge, all of it points towards someone intimately familiar with the household's routines, someone who believed they could control what we would see and what we would overlook. And that, Inspector, is the beginning of the trail we must follow." The tension in the room seemed to thicken, the shadows lengthening with the sinking sun. Miss Marple's observations had transformed a scene that seemed chaotic into one that hinted at a carefully orchestrated narrative. Every detail she had noticed, the overlooked smudges, the hesitant statements, the faint creaks, the peculiar choice of a playing card, formed the first visible threads of a web that would soon reveal the mind behind Colonel Blackwood's death. And as the evening drew near, the quiet certainty in her eyes suggested that the solution, though still distant, was already beginning to take shape. The following morning brought a crisp, almost brittle clarity to the air outside Blackwood Manor, but inside the tension had only thickened. Miss Marple began her day with the household gathered in the drawing-room, the windows thrown open to chase the lingering chill, though none of them seemed inclined to relax. There was a certain stiffness to the room. The maid Clara, pale and jittery, perched near the hearth. Philip Blackwood, hands clasped behind his back, avoided looking directly at anyone. The cook, Mrs. Withers, sat primly with her knitting, though her eyes darted about the room with a watchful alertness that suggested she had more to say than she admitted, and the gardener, Mr. Stokes, leaned against a side table, stoic and silent, as though the events of the past night had passed him by entirely. Miss Marple, taking her customary seat in the corner with a gentle air of quiet authority, began her questioning subtly. She started with Clara, her voice soft, inviting, as if coaxing a shy child to speak. "Clara, you mentioned yesterday a shadow near the back staircase. Was it moving deliberately, or simply a trick of the light?" Clara fidgeted, twisting a handkerchief between trembling fingers. I think it was someone moving, ma'am. I wasn't sure. It was so dark. But I could swear it was a person. I didn't dare call anyone because I didn't want to be wrong." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "And did anyone else approach the library last night, to your knowledge?" Clara hesitated, glancing toward the others in the room. I can't be certain, ma'am. I heard footsteps sometimes, but I couldn't see who. And perhaps someone else came to check on the Colonel? I don't know." The ambiguity in Clara's words did not escape Miss Marple. Hesitation could indicate uncertainty, but it could also signal concealment. She noted the careful omissions, the way Clara's eyes flitted toward the relatives, as if seeking validation or fearing reproach. She then turned to Philip Blackwood, who shifted slightly at her gaze. "Philip, you said the Colonel was in good spirits, yet preoccupied. What occupied his mind?" Philip's lips tightened. "Nothing specific," Just personal affairs, I imagine. There were letters, some old business with his regiment, routine correspondence. Miss Marple inclined her head. Did he mention anyone in particular? Any visitor expected last night? No, I don't believe so, Philip said quickly, too quickly, as Miss Marple noted. He was alone mostly. He liked the quiet, you know that. Miss Marple made a mental note. There was a subtle defensiveness in his words, an eagerness to appear informed yet detached. Such behaviour often concealed something more than mere concern. Next, she addressed Mrs. Withers. "Cook, you mentioned the Colonel was agitated last evening. Can you tell me more?" Mrs. Withers cleared her throat, her knitting dropping slightly. "He was pacing, yes, muttering about a letter he had received. I didn't see it, but I heard him murmur. Well, things I can't quite recall, but I thought it nothing of it. People worry, that's all." "And yet the body was found in the library this morning, unmoved, with the writing incomplete," Miss Marple pressed gently. "Did you notice anyone entering or leaving the library during the night?" Mrs. Withers hesitated. I thought I heard the back door open, perhaps, but it might have been the wind, and sometimes Mr. Stokes. He moves about the grounds at odd hours, but I cannot say for certain." Miss Marple's eyes flicked toward Mr. Stokes, who had remained silent until now. "Mr. Stokes, were you near the house last night after your usual rounds?" The gardener's expression did not change, but his voice was low, careful. "I tend to my work at night occasionally." "But the library? Number I keep my distance. Colonel Blackwood liked solitude, and I respected that." Miss Marple allowed a small pause, letting the silence stretch, giving each person a chance to fill the emptiness with more words, voluntarily or otherwise. It was a method she often found revealing. As the questioning progressed, contradictions began to emerge. Clara had mentioned footsteps near the back staircase, but Mrs. Withers dismissed them as possibly Mr. Stokes. Philip claimed the Colonel had been alone, yet Mrs. Withers had overheard muttering about a letter. Stokes insisted he had kept his distance, though the cook's uncertain recollection suggested otherwise. Even minor details began to accumulate into a pattern, a tapestry of partial truths, omissions, and subtle inconsistencies. Miss Marple's attention shifted to mannerisms, not just words. Clara's fidgeting, Philip's quick retorts, Mrs. Withers' nervous vigilance, and Stokes's stoic restraint all spoke volumes. The eagerness of some contrasted sharply with the reluctance of others. Some seemed eager to cooperate, perhaps to appear blameless. Others withheld, perhaps out of loyalty, fear, or culpability. Each small gesture, each hesitation, added layers to the picture Miss Marple was constructing. Then there was the matter of the Ace of Spades. Philip had taken a keen interest in its discovery, asking repeatedly if Grayson had examined it. Mrs. Withers had been unusually concerned that it should not be mishandled, while Clara appeared almost indifferent. Stokes, however, remained unmoved, his eyes betraying nothing. Miss Marple filed away these reactions carefully. Human responses to symbolic items often revealed more than their words ever could. After a pause, she allowed herself a quiet observation. "It seems to me that the Colonel's final hours were not entirely solitary and not entirely peaceful. Someone knew his habits, someone who moved with familiarity and discretion. But each of you presents a different version of the night, each with its own gaps and contradictions. This, to my mind, suggests that truth is deliberately obscured, layered beneath careful observation and performance." Philip shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "You mean someone here?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple said softly, "but not necessarily among those present. Some stories are woven to mislead, to draw attention away from what truly occurred. The challenge is to untangle these threads without being deceived by the surface appearance." As the morning wore on, Miss Marple excused herself briefly, walking to the library once more. The room, now silent and stripped of its occupant, revealed new subtleties upon her second inspection. The faint creases in the carpet suggested repeated movement along a path she had not considered before. The subtle tilt of a picture frame, the slight draught near a corner of the window, the very arrangement of books on the lower shelf, all seemed inconsequential at first, yet when viewed alongside the testimonies, contradictions, and hidden motives, they became potentially significant. Returning to the drawing-room, she resumed her questioning, this time with a different tact. "Philip, you mentioned the Colonel received letters. Do you recall anything specific he read aloud, even partially?" Philip faltered. "Nothing aloud, really. Perhaps a phrase here or there. Something about old acquaintances, debts, matters from long ago. But he rarely spoke of it." Miss Marple noted his hesitation. "And did he seem worried? Anxious?" Philip hesitated, then nodded. "Perhaps. But he was always a serious man, not easily rattled. That I cannot answer with certainty." Clara, overhearing, added softly, "I heard him muttering to himself. About someone, I think, though I couldn't make out who." Mrs. Withers glanced nervously between them. "I may have heard something similar, but who can say? People speak in half-truths when alone." Miss Marple allowed a quiet smile. The half-truths, contradictions, and selective recollections were exactly what she had anticipated. Voices of deception often sang in harmony and dissonance at once, each note revealing a shade of intent, a glimpse of hidden motive. By late afternoon, she had pieced together enough to see that multiple narratives were being maintained intentionally. Some were intended to protect, others to mislead. There was one version of the night that was shared, superficially coherent, but beneath it lay discrepancies too deliberate to ignore. It was not merely a question of what had occurred, but why certain details were emphasized and others omitted. Miss Marple gathered her notebook and looked around at the household. "Each of you has given me pieces of the night," she said quietly, yet with a weight that filled the room. "Some of your truths are sincere, others shaded with caution, fear, or intention. The task before us is to determine which pieces fit into the true sequence of events, and which have been placed to divert attention. The Colonel's death is not merely a matter of accident or natural causes. It is a puzzle, and each of you holds a fragment, whether knowingly or not." The room fell silent, the tension coiling tighter with each passing moment. Miss Marple, in her calm and unassuming way, had begun to untangle the web of deception that surrounded Colonel Blackwood's final hours. The contradictions, the half-answers, the eager yet guarded responses, they were all voices in a chorus of subtle manipulation, and she listened to them all with the patience and insight that had solved far more complex mysteries. As evening approached, a sense of anticipation filled the manor. Miss Marple could almost see the hidden currents shifting, the interplay of fear, loyalty, and ambition beneath the surface of genteel politeness. Somewhere within those layers of deception lay the truth of the Colonel's death, and she, with her quiet observation and patient deduction, was determined to follow every thread, to listen to every whispered inconsistency, until the voices revealed their secrets. Miss Marple spent the following morning in quiet contemplation, seated near the drawing-room window with her notebook open and a steaming cup of tea at her side. The manor, though stately and imposing, felt unusually heavy with suspicion, each corridor and shadow seeming to hold a secret. The previous day's interviews had yielded contradictions, half-truths, and subtle deceptions, but Miss Marple knew the truth was often buried beneath human complexity, rather than in any single glaring clue. She needed to trace motives, uncover connections, and determine why someone might have gone to such lengths to orchestrate Colonel Blackwood's final hours. She began with Philip Blackwood, whose composure had begun to fray under scrutiny. Sitting across from him at the polished mahogany table, she observed the slight tension in his hands, the restless glance toward the library door. "Philip," she began gently, "you mentioned the Colonel was preoccupied with personal affairs. Were these affairs financial in nature? Did he control a considerable estate?" Philip hesitated. "Well, yes. The Colonel's estate is significant, but nothing unusual in our family. There are properties, some investments, and he had been generous in distributing funds to various relatives over the years. But I don't see why that matters now." Miss Marple made a small note, nodding. "Generosity is one thing, but inheritance often sparks less visible forms of ambition. Were there any recent disagreements over property or financial matters?" Philip shifted, a shadow of unease crossing his face. There were minor disputes, family squabbles, nothing serious. Everyone wanted their due, but it was all handled discreetly. The air between them was taut with subtle tension, yet Miss Marple detected more than mere discomfort. Inheritance could breed resentment, but only if paired with opportunity and motive. Philip's eagerness to dismiss these disputes suggested a desire to avoid probing scrutiny. Next, Miss Marple turned to Mrs. Withers, who had always been protective of the household's image. She asked casually about her relationship with the Colonel and the other household members. "Cook, you have served the Blackwoods for many years. Did you ever notice any tensions between them, perhaps jealousy or rivalry?" Mrs. Withers' hands tightened around her knitting. Tensions? Well, I suppose every family has its little jealousies. Philip and the Colonel had their moments, though nothing overt. And Clara, the maid, sometimes gets a bit possessive of her duties. But I would never imagine anything sinister. We are a loyal household. Miss Marple's keen eye did not miss the flicker of something beneath the surface. The cook's loyalty was genuine, yet tinged with fear. Fear that unspoken resentments might unravel the delicate equilibrium of the manor. Even the most devoted servants could harbour subtle grievances or anxieties, each a potential spark in a household already strained by secrecy and tension. Clara, the maid, fidgeted when Miss Marple asked about her relationship with the Colonel. I always tried to be helpful, ma'am, but sometimes I think he favoured Philip more. He would give him small responsibilities, trust him with letters and documents. I just did my duties." Her voice wavered, and Miss Marple noted a faint, involuntary tightening of the jaw, a small, almost imperceptible expression of jealousy. Then there was Mr. Stokes, the gardener, who had seemed so detached and silent. When asked if he had any grievances with the Colonel, he spoke cautiously. "None at all. Colonel Blackwood respected the grounds as much as the house. I merely tend to them. But perhaps some outsiders might have wanted to gain favour, or gain something from the Colonel's death. I do not know their minds." Miss Marple nodded, sensing that the gardener's outward neutrality masked an awareness of tensions she would need to explore further. Opportunity alone rarely motivated crime. It was the combination of desire, grievance, and circumstance that created action. She began to map the subtle interplay of these motives. Financial ambition was the most obvious. Philip stood to inherit the estate, but only if the will remained unchanged. Greed could explain eagerness, yet it did not account for subtle theatrics, the ace of spades, the careful placement of objects, or the deliberate staging of the library. Someone with a simple desire for money might act more directly. Jealousy offered another thread. Clara's quiet resentment at being overlooked, Philip's frustration with the Colonel's preoccupations, or even Mrs. Withers' desire to maintain control over the household, could have provoked secretive acts. Yet none seemed to possess the meticulous knowledge required to execute the scene in the library with such precision. Revenge emerged as a subtler motive, woven in whispers of old quarrels. Miss Marple had noted hints of past military disputes mentioned in the Colonel's journal, minor slights from acquaintances, disagreements settled quietly but leaving embers behind. Could someone carry those embers into the present, shaping a death that appeared random yet was deeply personal? Fear, too, could drive action. The household's subtle anxieties suggested that someone was protective of a secret, desperate to control the narrative, and fearful of exposure. Miss Marple considered the possibility that the death was not the product of sudden impulse, but a calculated measure to conceal truths that would otherwise emerge. Miss Marple turned her thoughts to the physical clues in the manor, seeking where motives intersected with opportunity. The back staircase, the soot smudge, the displaced book, the inked journal, the ace of spades, all suggested intimate knowledge of the house's routines. The perpetrator moved with confidence, avoiding detection, yet left breadcrumbs, perhaps unintentionally or perhaps to taunt those who might investigate. Whoever they were, they understood the Colonel's habits and the staff's loyalties intimately. By mid-afternoon, Miss Marple had begun to weave together a tentative web of connections. Philip's financial motive intersected with his proximity to the Colonel. Clara's jealousy intersected with opportunity during the late-night hours. Mrs. Withers' protective loyalty intersected with subtle awareness of family tensions, and Stokes's silent vigilance intersected with knowledge of household movements and habits. Each motive alone was insufficient, but layered together, they suggested a complex tapestry, a labyrinth of intersecting ambitions and resentments. Miss Marple reflected on the inconsistencies she had recorded. Philip's insistence on the Colonel's solitary nature contradicted Mrs. Withers's recollection of his muttering over letters. Clara's hesitations hinted at observations she had not fully disclosed. Stokes' neutrality could hide awareness of a secret he deemed dangerous to reveal. The pieces did not yet form a single, clear narrative, but they began to shape a framework, revealing where deception intersected with opportunity and desire. She also considered the Colonel himself, whose habits and past relationships had created the conditions for this web. His meticulous nature, the careful preservation of letters, the habit of writing late at night, the trust placed in specific household members, these were the threads upon which someone might act, subtly and deliberately. The ace of spades, the interrupted journal, and the object's deliberate placement were not merely theatrics, but markers in a psychological map, each indicating control, misdirection, or hidden communication. By evening, Miss Marple had compiled a detailed diagram in her notebook, mapping each suspect, their motives, and potential access to the Colonel during the critical hours. The diagram revealed intersections, overlaps and tensions, financial gain, jealousy, revenge and fear, coexisting in a network too tangled for simple resolution. "Inspector," she said quietly, as Grayson entered the drawing room, "we are no longer looking for a single, straightforward motive. We are dealing with a mosaic of human desires, each interacting with opportunity and circumstance. The challenge is to determine which combination of motives and actions produce the result we see. And we must pay attention to the small inconsistencies, the subtle contradictions, and the carefully staged clues. They are the keys to understanding the full picture." Grayson leaned over her notes, a frown creasing his forehead. "It seems impossible. How can one death have so many potential reasons behind it?" Miss Marple allowed a gentle smile. "Human nature is rarely simple, Inspector, and crimes, when deliberate, reflect the complexity of those who commit them. We must trace each thread carefully, weigh each observation, and remain alert to both the words spoken and those deliberately left unspoken. The truth is rarely isolated. It is embedded within a network of motives, just as this house conceals its secrets within its walls." The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows through the manor, and the household retired for the night. Miss Marple sat quietly by the window, reviewing her notes, her mind working to untangle the overlapping motives she had uncovered. Greed, jealousy, revenge, and fear each played a part, yet none alone explained the precision of the crime. Somewhere in the convergence of these tangled impulses lay the explanation for Colonel Blackwood's death, and Miss Marple's patient observation, combined with her understanding of human nature, promised to uncover it in time. By nightfall, the motive maze had been sketched with careful attention, the first patterns emerging from the seeming chaos. Each suspect held a piece of the puzzle, and each piece revealed not only desire, but character, restraint, and intention. The web was intricate, but Miss Marple knew that, with patience and acute perception, even the most complex of human deceptions could be unravelled. And somewhere, in the interplay of ambition and secrecy, lay the path to the truth of Colonel Blackwood's silent demise. The following morning, Blackwood Manor buzzed with an uneasy excitement. News had arrived that a breakthrough in the investigation was imminent, or at least so the local authorities believed. Inspector Grayson, buoyed by a newfound confidence, gathered the household in the drawing-room, his brow high with satisfaction. A small leather pouch, carefully handled and catalogued by the constables, sat on the table before him. Inside it had been found a letter addressed to Colonel Blackwood, discovered tucked in an unused drawer of the back staircase, a letter containing a thin but striking revelation, a threat, subtle yet unmistakable, warning the Colonel of consequences should he disregard certain instructions. The handwriting was identified as Clara's. Clara's face, pale as the morning fog, betrayed both shock and fear. I never wrote such a thing," she protested, hands trembling as she gripped the edges of her apron. I don't even know how it came to be there." Inspector Grayson, however, was eager to assert the case's resolution. "See here, Miss Marple." The letter, clearly in the maid's hand, and the Colonel's death immediately following. How much clearer can it be? The motive is obvious. Clara wished to frighten him. Things went too far, and, unfortunately, the threat became real. Philip Blackwood nodded briskly as though relieved. "It is regrettable, but simple. No need to speculate further." Miss Marple, observing them both, kept her gaze gentle yet penetrating. On the surface, the chain of events seemed tidy. The letter, the threat, the death, and the apparent motive. But something about the narrative unsettled her, a quiet discord beneath the polished statements. She allowed Grayson to continue, making all the procedural notes of closure, while she studied Clara, noting the subtle tremor in her hands and the almost imperceptible widening of her eyes. Fear, yes, but not guilt. Later that morning, Miss Marple walked through the library once more, retracing her steps and thoughts from the previous days. The desk remained as it had been, objects untouched, evidence bags carefully placed. She ran her fingers lightly along the polished wood, noting the faint indentations in the surface, and allowed herself to visualize the night of the Colonel's death. Whoever had committed the act had done so with quiet deliberation, leaving both theatrical signs and subtle traces. But the letter, how convenient that it had appeared suddenly, discovered just when the authorities were seeking closure. A creeping sense of caution grew in her mind. "Too neat," she murmured aloud, not noticing that Philip had entered the room silently. The story of the letter fits perfectly for those eager to see the case resolved, but life rarely delivers such neat coincidences. Philip glanced at her, eyebrows furrowed. "Do you doubt what the evidence shows?" Miss Marple shook her head slowly. "Not doubt entirely, but I am cautious. One must always consider whether the evidence has been placed deliberately to mislead, and if fear alone is being mistaken for guilt." Philip's face hardened. "So, you suspect someone else?" "I suspect the truth is seldom obvious, and that appearances, especially when they align so perfectly with motive, may conceal rather than reveal it." She moved to the back staircase, inspecting the same steps she had noted before. The faint smudges remained, subtle but telling. Someone had moved there, yes, but if Clara had been there at all, it would have been unlikely to leave the precise trail that matched the subtle creases on the carpet and the soot smudge near the fireplace. The physical evidence suggested more than mere human coincidence. It suggested planning. Later, she requested to see the letter once again. Sitting at the table, she examined the script with the meticulous care of a jeweller inspecting a cut gem. The handwriting, she noted, was similar in style to Clara's, but the pressure of the pen and certain idiosyncrasies seemed slightly exaggerated, almost as though someone had deliberately mimicked it. It was a subtle difference, imperceptible to all but a keen eye. And yet, if the goal had been to shift suspicion onto an innocent party, it was perfectly executed. "Inspector," she said quietly, calling him aside, "may I see the handwriting comparisons again? I wish to examine them closely." Grayson, eager to maintain the appearance of a closed case, hesitated. "There's little point, Miss Marple. The constables have compared the letters carefully. Clara's hand is clearly evident." Miss Marple's eyes, calm but unwavering, met his. Sometimes a clever forger can mimic even a practiced hand, especially when the target is under pressure and fearful. It is not common, but it is possible, and in this instance, it may be the key to understanding why this death seems too convenient. Grayson sighed, a flicker of doubt crossing his otherwise confident demeanour. "So, you think we have the wrong culprit?" "Not necessarily," she replied, turning back to the letter. "But I think we must be wary of declaring victory prematurely. There are too many moving parts: the placement of objects, the choice of symbolic items, the precise arrangement of the room. Someone is orchestrating appearances, and the letter may be part of that performance." Her attention returned to Clara, who sat quietly near the fireplace, her hands folded tightly in her lap. There was genuine fear there, but Miss Marple's keen eye detected no malice. The maid's testimony had been hesitant at first, yet consistent in the small, truthful details easily overlooked by those in a rush to solve the case. Miss Marple spent the afternoon walking through the manor, revisiting each suspect in turn. Philip, while eager to see the case closed, revealed subtle irritations when questioned further about his father's private affairs. Mrs. Withers, who outwardly displayed concern for Clara, seemed more protective of the household's reputation than of justice. Even Stokes, silent and stoic, allowed small hints to slip in his careful phrasing, indications that he had observed something beyond what he disclosed. Each person's behaviour, she realised, could support a neat, false solution, but only by leaving gaps for deception to flourish. As evening fell, the authorities moved to finalise their report. Inspector Grayson, buoyed by the apparent evidence of the letter, prepared to declare the case closed, sending constables to place Clara under temporary custody until formal procedures were completed. The household, relieved yet subdued, accepted the narrative with a mixture of resignation and approval. A sense of order had returned, though it was fragile and built on the convenience of assumption. Miss Marple, however, remained standing by the library window, observing the long shadows stretching across the manicured gardens. She considered the sequence of events, the physical clues, the contradictory testimonies, and the motives she had painstakingly mapped. Something about the apparent resolution felt incomplete, too neat, too eager to satisfy the human desire for closure. She allowed herself a quiet smile, recognizing the danger in such premature certainty. The true criminal, she suspected, was already aware of the false victory declared in their favour. Someone patient, meticulous, and careful, watching the authorities celebrate their apparent success, waiting for the moment when the deception's final layer would be revealed. The ace of spades, the journal, the ink smear, the minor inconsistencies, all remained signals, subtle markers pointing toward a more intricate orchestration. Clara's tears and pleas, while genuine, did not reconcile with the theatre of the crime scene. Miss Marple felt certain that the maid had been manipulated, intentionally implicated, to satisfy a superficial reading of motive. The orchestrator of the colonel's death had accounted for human tendencies, for the eagerness of authorities, and for the psychological impact of fear, constructing a narrative so compelling that even trained observers might accept it without scrutiny. As night settled over Blackwood Manor, the household retired with uneasy relief. Miss Marple remained by the window, notebook in hand, contemplating the layers yet unseen. A false victory had been declared, but she sensed that the shadow of the true culprit lingered just beyond perception. Patience, she knew, would reveal the subtle movements, the hidden manipulations, and the final truth. The room was silent, save for the soft ticking of a clock on the mantel, marking time in deliberate rhythm, and as Miss Marple traced the evidence once more in her mind, she realized that the final revelation would arrive not through haste, nor through the eagerness of authorities, but through careful observation, quiet deduction, and a willingness to see beyond appearances. The real criminal remained in the shadows, content to watch, to wait, and to strike at the precise moment when certainty had lulled the household into complacency. Miss Marple awoke before dawn, the manor still shrouded in darkness and silence. The previous day's events had left her with a lingering unease, a sense that the false resolution imposed by Inspector Grayson had not accounted for the deeper currents beneath the household's surface. As she sipped her morning tea by the window, her mind returned again and again to the colonel's journals, the scattered clues in the library, and the subtle contradictions in the testimonies. Something had been overlooked, something small and seemingly insignificant, yet potent enough to connect the threads of this tangled web. Her first stop was the library, where the colonel's personal collection of papers and correspondence was stored. She moved carefully along the shelves, noting the faint dust patterns and the careful placement of volumes. One folder, older and more worn than the others, had been overlooked in the initial sweep, a collection of letters tied with faded ribbon. She untied the bundle and leafed through the pages, her eyes catching an old incident referenced in passing, a dispute from decades earlier, during Colonel Blackwood's early military service. The letters mentioned a minor scandal involving a fellow officer, Philip's father, and a financial disagreement that had ended quietly, but with lingering resentment. Miss Marple's interest sharpened. This old grievance, long buried and seemingly resolved, could have left ripples reaching into the present. She remembered subtle hints from Philip, his discomfort when discussing financial matters, his eagerness to see the case closed, and the small, almost imperceptible tension when speaking about the Colonel's late-night correspondence. It was plausible that these old conflicts had seeded present motives, blending with opportunity to produce a lethal convergence. Her next visit was to the household archives, where records of the staff's employment, references, and personal histories were kept. While examining them, she discovered a curious detail. Clara's family had a distant connection to the Blackwoods, dating back several generations. A faint, almost forgotten feud had existed between the two lines, minor slights passed down as whispers and half-remembered stories. Though Clara herself might have been unaware of the animosity, the revelation provided context for the strange intensity of her fear and the subtle hesitations in her testimony. Even subconscious awareness of family history could shape behaviour, influencing responses in a crisis. Miss Marple's thoughts then returned to Mrs. Withers. She had always been protective, almost hyper-vigilant about appearances. Going through old service records, Miss Marple found that Mrs. Withers had previously worked in a household where financial mismanagement had led to scandal. She was no stranger to the dangers of secrecy and manipulation, and her protective instincts might explain her keen observation of the household dynamics, her interventions, and her subtle guidance of narratives during questioning. The past, it seemed, had shaped not only motives but also patterns of behaviour that could easily mislead investigators. Her attention shifted to Mr. Stokes, the gardener, whose stoic silence had concealed subtle knowledge. Digging through the property's historical records, Miss Marple discovered that Stokes had been employed for decades, first under the previous generation of Blackwoods. He had witnessed disputes and reconciliations, minor acts of malice, and moments of unspoken tension. In the context of a carefully orchestrated crime, his intimate knowledge of the estate's routines, the placement of objects, and the behaviour of household members provided a quiet but powerful tool, enabling him, or someone with his insight, to manipulate appearances. Piecing these strands together, Miss Marple realised that the crime was not merely a product of present-day ambition or anger, but a culmination of overlapping histories, grudges, and personal dynamics. The Colonel's death could be understood only in the context of these lingering connections: a decades-old financial dispute between fathers, family tensions simmering quietly, patterns of behaviour established long ago, and knowledge passed down through observation and experience. To explore these connections further, Miss Marple requested to speak again with the household, this time guiding the conversation with care, focusing on memories, old incidents, and shared histories. Philip, when prompted about his father's military associations, hesitated, then admitted that tensions had persisted even after resolution. "Old disagreements die hard," he said cautiously, "and while we move past them, perhaps they influence the way we view inheritance and loyalty." Clara, prompted gently about family history, blushed and looked down. I never thought much of it, Ma'am, but some stories are told in whispers. Grandmother said the Blackwoods were proud that they had not forgotten past wrongs." Mrs. Withers nodded. "I have seen grudges carried forward silently. One forgets them outwardly, yet the shadow lingers, shaping caution and influence. Even Stokes, stoic as ever, admitted that he had observed patterns over decades, habits repeated, and reactions predictable. Old ways die slowly, he said, and when the house changes, the old grudges still echo in small ways, unnoticed by those who don't pay attention." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with understanding. Here was the root of the intricacies she had observed. The present crime had drawn on the past, exploiting old tensions, subtly blending fear, jealousy, and ambition into a scenario that seemed straightforward to all but the most observant. The letter, the placement of the ace of spades, the manipulated testimonies, all could be traced to someone aware of these long-standing connections, someone who understood both human nature and the particular dynamics of Blackwood Manor. She returned to the library with a renewed sense of purpose. Standing in the centre of the room, she traced the flow of movement the night of the Colonel's death. The smudge near the fireplace, the subtle creases on the carpet, the faintly displaced book, all aligned with knowledge someone like Stokes or a similarly observant figure would possess. The criminal had orchestrated the scene using not brute force or obvious threats, but the quiet leverage of familiarity, exploiting patterns rooted in history. As she examined the letters and journals once more, Miss Marple realized that the interplay of old and new motives created a complex lattice of influence. Each suspect, whether driven by conscious ambition, latent fear, or inherited tension, had become entangled in circumstances that had been shaped decades before. The crime was a culmination of generational threads, human impulses preserved and amplified over time, and the meticulous exploitation of knowledge both past and present. By late afternoon, Miss Marple had begun to see the outline of a final narrative. The letter, so neatly discovered and conveniently incriminating, was a red herring, a piece of theatre intended to mislead. The real orchestrator had understood history, leverage, and human psychology in equal measure, using them to manipulate appearances, test loyalties, and shift suspicion. The crime was no longer a simple act. It was a performance built on the shadows of the past, designed to appear chaotic while concealing precise intent. Miss Marple called Inspector Grayson to her side. "Inspector, the crime is not what it seems," she said quietly. "It draws upon histories and connections that have been long forgotten or ignored. The present-day actors are influenced by old disputes, latent loyalties, and inherited tensions. We cannot rely solely on the apparent evidence or on superficial confessions. The real culprit is someone who understands these dynamics, someone who has used the past to orchestrate the present." Grayson frowned, his confidence tempered by her quiet insistence. "You mean someone we never suspected?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple replied, "or perhaps someone who has concealed their knowledge cleverly. The past has shadows, Inspector, and some of those shadows walk among us, guiding events without notice. To solve this crime, we must illuminate those shadows, trace the connections, and see not only what has happened, but why it has happened in this precise manner." The household moved about with polite propriety that evening, yet Miss Marple noticed a subtle shift in behaviour. Small glances exchanged, hushed tones at doorways, and the lingering presence of old grudges seemed to echo the patterns she had identified. Every gesture, every hesitation, carried the weight of historical influence. As night fell over Blackwood Manor, Miss Marple sat by the library window, her notebook filled with diagrams, family trees, and cross-referenced observations. The crime was no longer a simple act of ambition or fear. It was an intricate design, a deliberate culmination of the past entwined with the present. The shadows of history had moved in quiet ways, shaping opportunity and motive, and the person who had exploited them remained close, patient, and calculating. She leaned back in her chair, sipping her tea, allowing the weight of her observations to settle. The case was far from resolved. The threads of history, carefully intertwined with human ambition, jealousy, and fear, would guide her next steps, and the criminal, hidden in plain sight, would soon reveal themselves through the very patterns they had so meticulously relied upon. Miss Marple had spent the early hours of the morning reviewing her notes, her eyes tracing the intricate web of history, motives, and subtle clues she had carefully assembled. The case of Colonel Blackwood's death had grown more complex with every revelation, old grudges, familial tensions, carefully staged evidence, and personalities shaped by decades of private histories. One thing had become clear: straightforward questioning would not yield the truth. The criminal was clever, patient, and skilled at manipulating appearances. To uncover them, Miss Marple would need an unconventional approach. She began by considering the dynamics of the household, the way each suspect interacted, what they revealed inadvertently, and what they deliberately concealed. Observation alone had exposed contradictions, yet all seemed to maintain a facade of innocence when directly confronted. Miss Marple knew that the human mind often betrayed itself when engaged in subtle psychological tests, small scenarios that revealed inconsistencies or unexpected reactions. If she could provoke the correct stimulus, she might witness a reaction that exposed the person behind the meticulously orchestrated crime. The first step was to arrange a seemingly innocuous afternoon gathering. She invited the household into the drawing room under the pretense of examining the Colonel's library records, presenting herself as seeking their assistance in cataloguing documents and artifacts. Each suspect arrived, wary but curious, their faces carefully neutral. Miss Marple maintained her calm, cheerful demeanour, creating an atmosphere that seemed ordinary, mundane, yet charged with invisible tension. She began by asking the group to handle a series of small items from the library, objects that had been part of the scene the night of the Colonel's death: the ace of spades, a small inked journal, a candle holder with faint smudges, and a folded letter that had been carefully placed in evidence. "I find that sometimes, by handling the objects themselves, people remember things they might have forgotten otherwise," she said gently. "The mind often connects with memory through touch." Clara, as expected, moved hesitantly, her fingers trembling slightly as she picked up the ace of spades. Mrs. Withers assisted her carefully, steadying the objects, while Philip observed closely, his posture rigid and attentive. Stokes remained stoic, methodical, examining each item with quiet concentration. Miss Marple began her unconventional tactic, a subtle psychological test designed to gauge reactions under minor controlled stress. She proposed a small exercise. "Let us consider a hypothetical scenario," she said softly, her voice warm yet precise. "Imagine that we know the truth of the Colonel's last hours, but it is hidden from us. If we had to reconstruct the sequence of events, considering both what is seen and unseen, how would we proceed? Would we follow the obvious leads, or would we consider subtler signs, small movements, inconsistencies, things overlooked?" Her words were designed not to accuse, but to provoke reflection. Each person's reaction would reveal something: hesitation, discomfort, overeagerness, or subtle defensiveness. Miss Marple watched carefully. Philip predictably spoke first. One would follow the most obvious evidence: the letter, the placement of objects, the witnesses' statements. These form a coherent sequence. His tone was assertive, almost defensive, as though asserting control over a narrative he wished to believe secure. Clara remained silent, eyes wide, glancing between Miss Marple and Philip. Mrs. Withers spoke gently. "I think one must consider intention and opportunity together, and perhaps the psychology of the household itself. One's understanding of people is as important as any physical evidence." Stokes, quiet until now, added in measured tones, "Patterns in behaviour often reveal more than appearances. One must consider what people omit as carefully as what they reveal." Miss Marple allowed each statement to settle, then introduced the unconventional element, a controlled provocation designed to elicit an unconscious reaction. She picked up the inked journal and opened it to a page the Colonel had begun writing in the last hours before his death. The page was unfinished, but the content referenced someone's secret knowledge, someone whose actions had been carefully observed. "Let us consider," Miss Marple said, holding the journal deliberately in Philip's direction, "that a person had to manipulate events with great care to produce a convincing story. They had to account for others' movements, adjust for timing, and anticipate reactions. Suppose they believed their plan flawless, yet overlooked a single detail. How might that manifest?" She let the question hang, a quiet pressure in the room. The air shifted imperceptibly, and Miss Marple noted the micro-expressions that betrayed unease. Clara's lips pressed tightly together, but her hands remained steady. Mrs. Withers' eyebrows lifted fractionally, a subtle acknowledgement of the scenario's tension. Philip, however, shifted abruptly in his seat, his fingers clenching the armrests, and he coughed, a faint, involuntary noise. It was a small reaction, easy to overlook. Yet in Miss Marple's experience, these micro-reactions often spoke louder than words. The shift in posture, the involuntary cough, the slight narrowing of the eyes, all indicated a cognitive dissonance. He was reacting not merely to the exercise, but to the implications within it. To further probe, Miss Marple introduced a subtle trick, a suggestion that the sequence of events could be tested empirically. She proposed recreating, hypothetically, the movements in the library on the night of the Colonel's death, using the objects as markers, but emphasizing that the test was hypothetical and entirely for observation of patterns. Philip's reaction was instantaneous. He leaned forward, his hand tightening on the edge of the table. "That would be unnecessary," he said, his voice brisk, betraying impatience. "We know what happened. There is no need to repeat it." Miss Marple nodded calmly, letting his words linger in the air. "Perhaps not," she said softly. "But sometimes seeing actions repeated, even hypothetically, can illuminate truths invisible at first glance. Even those who believe themselves careful may leave a trace." Philip's fingers twitched. He cleared his throat, glanced toward the journal, then looked away quickly. The subtle crack in his composure, fleeting though it was, spoke volumes. Miss Marple noted it quietly in her notebook. His eagerness to dismiss the exercise, coupled with his visible discomfort when confronted with the possibility of reconstructing events, suggested a nervous awareness of something more than mere procedural observation. Clara, observing this, bit her lip but remained still, showing genuine anxiety yet no guilt. Mrs. Withers, protective but composed, watched the interaction with mild concern. Stokes, ever impassive, shifted slightly in his chair, as though aware of the unspoken tension but maintaining his calm exterior. Miss Marple leaned forward gently, choosing her next words with care. "Sometimes, Inspector," she said, addressing Grayson, who had observed quietly, "the most telling evidence is not the object itself, nor even the written record, but the way people react when the spotlight is shifted in subtle ways. Fear, deception, and guilt often manifest in the smallest of movements, unnoticed unless carefully observed." Grayson, frowning, glanced at Philip, whose face had regained a carefully neutral expression, yet the tension remained in his posture, a silent tremor beneath the polished exterior. Miss Marple had created a controlled environment that forced a glimpse of truth to surface, not through confrontation, but through an unconventional tactic that leveraged psychology and observation. By evening, Miss Marple had pieced together a clearer picture. Philip's over-eagerness to assert control over the narrative, his involuntary reactions during the hypothetical exercise, and the subtle tension in his posture indicated that he was more intimately involved than he had admitted. The ace of spades, the letter, and the physical staging of the library were not random. They had been carefully orchestrated, exploiting the household's assumptions and the authorities' eagerness to declare closure. Miss Marple allowed herself a quiet satisfaction. The unconventional tactic, creating a hypothetical scenario and observing micro-reactions, had revealed a crack in Philip's deception. It was small, almost imperceptible, but enough to suggest that the real resolution of the case was close at hand. The criminal, so clever in manipulating appearances and leveraging history, had underestimated the subtle power of observation and psychological insight. As night fell over Blackwood Manor, Miss Marple sat by the library window, notebook in hand, reviewing the events of the afternoon. The shadows of the past, the tangled motives, and the false victories had all been crucial in shaping the crime, yet this small revelation, the crack revealed by a psychological test, had brought her one step closer to unveiling the truth. Patience and careful observation had worked where straightforward methods failed, and she knew that the final confrontation would require both insight and delicacy. Somewhere in the house the real criminal remained, unaware that the facade they had so carefully maintained had begun to fracture. Miss Marple, ever patient and keen, would see to it that the truth emerged, not through accusation, but through the careful illumination of small, telling details and the careful unravelling of deception. The morning at Blackwood Manor began quietly, deceptively so. The household moved through its routines with polite propriety, yet under the surface, tension had thickened. Miss Marple, having observed the subtle cracks in Philip's composure the day before, felt that the investigation had finally begun to gain momentum. With the micro-reactions she had recorded still fresh in her mind, she intended to follow them, carefully piecing together the sequence of the Colonel's death. What she could not have anticipated was that the investigation itself would become a target, a shadowed battlefield where evidence vanished before her eyes. The day began with Miss Marple and Inspector Grayson revisiting the library, retracing the steps the Colonel had taken in his final hours. Every object, every placement, every small smudge and crease in the carpet seemed to speak volumes when considered in combination. Miss Marple had brought with her a selection of the Colonel's documents and personal notes, the very materials that had revealed the intersections of motive, history, and opportunity. She intended to examine them again, slowly, methodically, to confirm her suspicions about the orchestration of the crime. Yet when she reached the desk where the Colonel's journals were kept, a pang of unease tightened her chest. The small leather journal, the one she had previously identified as containing subtle telling entries, was gone. She looked around, her eyes scanning the room for any hint of misplacement or careless handling. Nothing. The journal had vanished. "Inspector," she said quietly, keeping her voice calm despite the sudden alarm. "The journal. It is missing." Grayson's brow furrowed. "Missing? Are you certain it was here this morning?" Miss Marple nodded. "I placed it here myself before breakfast. It was carefully arranged among the other documents. Someone has removed it." A hush fell over the room. Philip, who had been observing with an outwardly neutral expression, shifted slightly, glancing toward the door as though weighing whether to speak. Clara and Mrs. Withers exchanged nervous looks, their hands clasped tightly. Stokes, standing near the window, remained stoic, though the subtle tightening of his jaw betrayed the same flicker of concern Miss Marple had seen in others before, a silent acknowledgement that the incident was unusual and dangerous. Miss Marple moved to the window, drawing back the curtains slightly. "This is not a casual misplacement," she murmured. "The removal of the journal is deliberate. Someone intends to obstruct the investigation, to prevent the truth from emerging, and they acted quickly, deliberately, to erase a crucial link." Grayson frowned, his authority challenged by the implication. "Do you suspect one of the household?" "It is likely," Miss Marple replied. "Opportunities to remove the journal were limited, and someone with knowledge of its importance and the confidence to act has done so. We must consider who knew of its existence and significance, and who had access when the household was unobserved." She turned her attention to the layout of the manor. The library was enclosed, with only the main door and a small back passage providing entry. Each suspect's movements during the morning were accounted for, though the precise times of comings and goings were slightly ambiguous. A window had been left slightly ajar overnight, perhaps for ventilation, but the faint traces outside indicated no passage. The journal had been taken from within, quietly, without disturbance. The perpetrator was careful, deliberate, and aware of the patterns she had meticulously documented. Miss Marple called the household together once more. "I must ask for full cooperation. Whoever has the journal must return it. The investigation relies upon its contents, and anyone withholding it, intentionally or not, risks compounding suspicion." Philip, frowning, offered, "We should search the rooms immediately. Perhaps it was misplaced or carried elsewhere by mistake." Miss Marple allowed the suggestion, and the household dispersed to search. Clara moved with evident anxiety, checking drawers and corners methodically. Mrs. Withers supervised the process, ensuring that nothing was overlooked. Stokes, methodical as ever, moved silently from shelf to shelf, noting small displacements but finding nothing. Even Inspector Grayson participated, though his usual confidence was tempered by the inexplicable absence of the journal. Hours passed. Rooms were searched and researched, hidden corners, previously overlooked passages, and even storage areas beneath the staircase were examined. Yet the journal remained missing. Miss Marple observed the search quietly, her keen eyes noting each reaction, each micro-expression. Small signs betrayed frustration, irritation, and unease, but only one person's responses suggested more than mere concern. Philip's insistence on redirecting searches, combined with subtle attempts to question the thoroughness of others, created a pattern of behaviour that could not be ignored. By late afternoon, the impossibility of the journal's disappearance had begun to weigh heavily on the investigation. Miss Marple, however, remained composed. She had anticipated that someone might attempt to interfere. After all, the manipulation of appearances and evidence had been a hallmark of this crime from the beginning. The question was no longer who committed the original act, but who had the audacity and foresight to remove such a critical link. While the household regrouped in the drawing-room, Miss Marple employed an unconventional tactic to test their composure. She suggested a new exercise, a hypothetical scenario in which another key document, a forged note, an additional piece of evidence, was introduced and its movements observed. Each person's reactions would reveal whether they were invested in concealing information and whether their demeanour aligned with opportunity and motive. The results were subtle but telling. Clara remained nervous but consistent, showing genuine fear yet no signs of duplicity. Mrs. Withers, protective as always, displayed measured concern, watching others carefully but offering no misdirection. Stokes maintained his calm exterior, though his eyes hinted at recognition of the journal's importance. Philip, however, shifted uneasily, his voice tightening when hypothetical scenarios suggested scrutiny. He avoided direct eye contact, fidgeted with his cuff, and spoke defensively when pressed for detail. Miss Marple recorded each subtle reaction, her mind connecting patterns with previous observations. The letter, the staged ace of spades, the meticulously arranged library, and now the vanished journal. A thread emerged, delicate yet distinct, pointing towards someone who not only possessed motive and opportunity, but also understood the importance of control over appearances, over evidence, and over the narrative itself. As evening fell, Miss Marple considered the implications. The stolen journal raised the stakes of the investigation significantly. Whoever had removed it was aware of the progress she had made and sought to delay or mislead. The case was no longer simply a matter of observation and deduction. It had become a subtle battle of wits, a struggle to uncover truth while countering deliberate interference. Trust within the household was fragile. Each suspect could potentially obstruct progress, intentionally or inadvertently, and every action, every word, and every hesitation became critical. Miss Marple reflected on the patterns she had observed. The subtle crack in Philip's composure from the previous day, coupled with his behaviour during the search, indicated that he may have been involved in the journal's disappearance. Yet certainty required patience and careful observation. The criminal was clever, capable of both action and deception, and Miss Marple knew that a premature accusation could allow them to conceal further evidence or manipulate perception once more. She gathered her notes, reviewing each observation, each motive, and each reaction in sequence. The web of past grievances, financial ambitions, subtle jealousies, and now deliberate interference revealed a sophisticated orchestration. The criminal had anticipated scrutiny, accounted for psychological testing, and acted with foresight to obscure critical evidence. Miss Marple allowed herself a small, controlled smile. The disappearance of the journal, while alarming, was not insurmountable. It was simply another layer of challenge, another opportunity to observe behaviour under pressure and reveal the person behind the meticulous deception. The real criminal, whoever it was, remained hidden, but Miss Marple could feel the threads tightening, the sequence of events converging toward revelation. The journal's absence was temporary. Patience, careful observation, and a keen understanding of human nature would ensure it surfaced, along with the truth it concealed. As night enveloped Blackwood Manor, Miss Marple remained at her desk, quietly reviewing patterns, reactions, and histories. Outside, shadows stretched across the estate, mirroring the hidden manoeuvres of the criminal within. The vanishing evidence had raised the stakes, but it had also illuminated a subtle truth. Those who act with deliberate cunning often reveal themselves in the smallest gestures, and the careful observer, patient and unhurried, is always ready to notice. The game was far from over, and the final moves would soon be made. The following morning, Blackwood Manor awoke under a pall of unease. The disappearance of the Colonel's journal had unsettled the household, and though Miss Marple had maintained calm composure, the tension was palpable. Even the usually stoic Stokes moved with a quiet vigilance, eyes scanning each corner as if anticipating mischief. Clara and Mrs. Withers spoke in hushed tones, their concern both genuine and tinged with fear. Philip, however, bore the marks of anxiety more subtly: rigid posture, careful avoidance of direct eye contact, and a tendency to hover near doorways. Miss Marple, ever observant, noted the subtle interplay of fear and calculation, an unspoken game in which the criminal sought to manipulate both the investigation and the people around them. She had just begun reviewing the layout of the library again, mapping movements and timing when a sharp sound cut through the otherwise quiet morning, a scream from the servant's wing. Instinctively, Miss Marple moved toward the source, her steps light but precise, her mind already racing through possibilities. Reaching the corridor, she found Clara, pale and trembling, pointing toward the laundry room. Mrs. Withers followed closely, her face tight with concern. Inside the laundry room lay the body of Mrs. Withers' younger niece, Emily, who had been visiting for the weekend. The girl's throat had been cut, precise and deliberate, leaving little doubt that this was no accident. A faint smear of soot on the floor suggested a struggle near the fireplace, but the attack itself had been swift. Panic rippled through the household. Clara collapsed into a chair, sobbing uncontrollably, while Philip's jaw tightened and his fists clenched. Miss Marple crouched beside the body, careful not to disturb the scene more than necessary. She observed quickly. The knife had been wiped clean before the attack, leaving only faint fingerprints too faint for casual detection. Nothing had been moved aside. The scene had been arranged to appear both sudden and unpreventable. Yet something felt different from the Colonel's death. The meticulousness here suggested both skill and a deliberate message. Whoever had acted wanted to terrify, to show that they remained several steps ahead. Inspector Grayson arrived shortly after, expression tight with tension. "Another murder?" he asked, scanning the room. "Good heavens! But why now?" Miss Marple's calm voice cut through his panic. "It is not a question of why now, Inspector, but rather who benefits from this display. The pattern is clear. The same person who removed the journal is making themselves visible, asserting control, and demonstrating that they are not yet caught." Philip, pale but composed, interjected, This changes everything. The household must be secured. No one leaves until we know who is responsible." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, noting his sudden emphasis on control. "We must assume the perpetrator is capable, cunning, and fully aware of our observations. The question is whether they acted alone or with assistance, and whether the threat is ongoing." She requested the household to remain in their rooms while she examined the scene more closely. The attack had been swift, but faint details remained. The placement of a small decorative figurine had shifted, the ash from the fireplace was scattered in an unusual pattern, and the faint scent of cologne lingered, not overpowering, but distinct. Miss Marple filed each observation carefully. The sudden escalation changed the focus of the investigation. The first murder had seemed tied to long-standing grievances, subtle manipulations, and staged evidence. This second act, however, was more brazen, a direct attempt to unsettle the household and perhaps to divert attention from the disappearing journal. Miss Marple began to map both crimes side by side, seeking connections in timing, method, and psychological manipulation. The perpetrator's audacity was a clear signal. They were not merely concealing their actions, they were playing a game of control. Miss Marple decided that a proactive tactic was required. She could no longer rely solely on observation. She needed to anticipate the perpetrator's moves. She arranged for the household to remain visible while she introduced subtle tests of opportunity and behavior. She moved a small collection of personal effects, then left a faintly open window leading into the room where the journal had previously been kept, suggesting to any observer that the documents were still accessible. Philip's reaction was almost immediate. He lingered near the window, casting cautious glances toward the library and corridors. His posture was tense, eyes flicking from shadow to shadow. Clara, frightened yet compliant, followed instructions without hesitation, while Mrs. Withers expressed concern but deferred to Miss Marple's authority. Stokes remained silent, observant, and unflinching, yet his gaze lingered on the subtle arrangements of furniture and objects, a careful mental mapping of opportunity and access. By afternoon, Miss Marple had gathered the household for a quiet discussion. "The second attack demonstrates that our criminal is agile and calculating," she said calmly. "They are using the element of surprise to destabilize our assumptions and divert our attention. We must proceed with caution and anticipate potential movements, understanding both the layout of the house and the motivations of those within it." She then revealed a psychological nuance. She had intentionally left a personal item, a small notebook, in the corridor near the room of the second victim, seemingly unattended. The notebook was inconsequential, yet it contained faint, conspicuous writing visible only at certain angles. Her goal was to provoke a reaction, to see who might move to manipulate or conceal it. Philip's eyes flicked to the notebook immediately. Then he paused, glancing toward the others as though measuring the consequences of interference. He stepped lightly toward it, then hesitated, his hand trembling ever so slightly. The subtle hesitation, the micro-expression of concern for appearance, revealed a crack in composure. Miss Marple noted it silently. Here was a person capable of careful orchestration, yet whose careful self-control was challenged by the possibility of observation. The implications were chilling. The perpetrator remained several steps ahead, yet their movements betrayed both familiarity and caution. Miss Marple realized that the criminal was not only clever, but intimately acquainted with the household, capable of predicting reactions and exploiting weaknesses. The second murder had been a message, a display of both capability and daring. The first crime, carefully staged with historical connections and subtle misdirection, had now been overshadowed by an overt act of intimidation. Miss Marple moved to discuss her suspicions with Inspector Grayson. "We must assume that another incident could occur," she said. "The second murder was not random. It was deliberate, intended to unsettle and distract. Whoever did this knows our procedures and our assumptions. They are watching, testing, and manipulating events to remain in control." Grayson, troubled, nodded. "We need security measures immediately. Guards, patrols, anyone who can prevent further tragedy." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, "but we must also anticipate psychological manipulation. Security alone cannot prevent a clever criminal from exploiting fear, distraction, or opportunity. Observation, insight, and subtle testing are our true tools. The criminal will continue to act unless they are caught off guard." By evening, the household was confined to the main drawing room, the corridors patrolled and monitored. Miss Marple moved quietly among them, observing posture, micro-expressions, and behaviour with meticulous attention. Philip's composure remained taut but fragile, the memory of the hypothetical notebook exercise evident in his careful movements. Clara and Mrs. Withers maintained visible anxiety, yet displayed no duplicity. Stokes remained observant and impassive, his knowledge of the estate's rhythms evident in the way he tracked each person's movement, without overt interference. Miss Marple concluded that the second attack had accomplished its intended purpose. It forced the household, and the authorities, into heightened alert, while revealing new information about the perpetrator's psychology and access. The criminal was bold, patient, and calculating, and they had demonstrated clearly that they were not yet finished. As night fell over Blackwood Manor, Miss Marple sat quietly at the library window, notebook open and pen in hand. She reviewed the sequence of both murders, the vanished journal, and the subtle reactions observed during the afternoon. The pattern was emerging. A person who understood opportunity, history, and human behaviour, exploiting each with meticulous care. The unexpected twist of a second murder had raised the stakes, but it had also illuminated a path forward. The criminal was still several steps ahead, yet every movement, every subtle reaction, and every carefully orchestrated act left traces. Miss Marple, patient and unhurried, would follow them, anticipating their next move and preparing to prevent further tragedy. In the shadows of Blackwood Manor, a dangerous game continued, but she knew that even the cleverest hand could be revealed by the keenest eye. Miss Marple sat by the drawing-room window, the evening light slanting across her notebook as she reviewed her observations. The second murder had shifted the atmosphere of Blackwood Manor from uneasy to electric with tension. The household moved as though under constant scrutiny, their movements careful, measured, and, in some cases, subtly defensive. Philip's careful composure, Clara's anxious energy, Mrs. Withers' protective watchfulness, and Stokes's quiet, calculated observation had all been catalogued. Yet, despite the chaos, Miss Marple felt that the threads of the mystery were drawing together, slowly, imperceptibly, but inexorably. The pieces were beginning to reveal a pattern, and as always, it was the smallest details that held the greatest significance. She began by revisiting her notes from the day of the first murder. The ace of spades, placed deliberately at the Colonel's desk, the letters with subtle references to past grievances, the slight smudge on the fireplace hearth, and the missing journal, all had seemed disparate at first. Each acted as a puzzle piece on its own, yet none provided the complete image. Then, with the second murder, the carefully staged nature of the attack, The minor adjustments in the environment and the faint, deliberate traces left behind added a new dimension. Miss Marple's keen eyes scanned her notes for a connecting thread, a subtle repetition, a behaviour, a clue overlooked amidst the more dramatic evidence. It came to her suddenly, almost imperceptibly. During the reconstruction of the second murder, she had observed a faint, nearly invisible pattern in the placement of objects. A figurine, a candle holder, even the slight disturbance of a rug. Alone, each shift seemed inconsequential, but taken together, they formed a directional guide, a silent choreography of movements, hinting at the perpetrator's familiarity with the estate and their ability to manipulate appearances. Then she remembered the seemingly casual comment made by Philip during one of their earlier discussions. It had passed almost unnoticed. "I always liked the symmetry of the manor. Everything should be in its proper place." At the time it had seemed trivial, perhaps even the mere musings of a fastidious man. But now, in light of the pattern emerging from the two murders and the vanished journal, Miss Marple realized the significance. The killer had been guided by an obsession with order, a desire to impose symmetry and narrative upon chaos. Every object, every action, and even the stage misdirection had been part of this internal logic. She revisited the placement of the ace of spades from the first murder. The card had been deliberately set near the colonel's hand, pointing slightly toward the desk's edge. At first, it appeared to be an arbitrary clue or an attempt at theatricality. But in the context of the broader pattern, the careful positioning of objects, the subtle manipulations of space, it became a signal, a faint indicator pointing toward the orchestrator's methodology. The perpetrator was meticulous, using physical arrangements not to conceal but to direct perception, to craft a narrative that would mislead investigators while satisfying their own need for control and precision. Miss Marple then considered the missing journal. Its disappearance had initially seemed a desperate act of obstruction. Now she saw that it too fit within the emerging pattern. The journal had been removed not merely to hide information, but as part of a sequence designed to provoke certain reactions, to test observation, to measure anxiety, and to manipulate the household's assumptions. Whoever had taken it understood the dynamics of attention and behavior, exploiting human nature as effectively as the physical space itself. Her mind returned to the second murder and the placement of subtle traces in the laundry room. A faint smear of soot along the edge of the fireplace, a slightly displaced figurine, the careful wiping of fingerprints, all were components of a broader choreography. Miss Marple's keen observation revealed that these actions had been intended to appear haphazard, but in reality they followed a consistent logic rooted in both spatial awareness and psychological manipulation. Each act was an extension of the perpetrator's understanding of control, how to arrange objects, how to evoke fear, and how to direct attention while remaining hidden in plain sight. A sudden recollection struck her. The habit of Philip checking the alignment of objects on the mantelpiece, his almost imperceptible need to adjust a picture frame or straighten a candlestick. At the time, she had noted this as a minor idiosyncrasy, trivial in comparison to the larger events. But in the context of the emerging pattern, this behavior took on new meaning. The killer's obsession with order and symmetry, paired with a familiarity with the household's layout and routines, pointed clearly towards someone capable of executing both murders and manipulating evidence with subtlety. Miss Marple cross-referenced her observations with the timelines of both murders. Each act of placement, each deviation in the environment, coincided with moments when the perpetrator had opportunity, yet each was carefully calculated to avoid direct confrontation. The combination of psychological manipulation and spatial precision revealed a dual approach. The criminal acted both physically and mentally, shaping events while shaping perceptions. Then, in reviewing the minor reactions during the hypothetical exercises she had staged, Miss Marple noticed another clue. Philip's reactions had been consistent with someone aware of the unfolding pattern, the tension when the notebook was introduced, the micro-expressions during the reconstruction of the colonel's movements, the subtle defensiveness when objects were handled or relocated. Each had seemed minor on its own, but combined with the emerging physical pattern, they confirmed that he was intimately familiar with the orchestration of the crimes. Miss Marple sat back, letting the pieces coalesce in her mind. The pattern was now unmistakable, a calculated interplay of spatial manipulation, historical knowledge, psychological insight, and opportunistic timing. Every subtle detail, from the ace of spades to the misplaced figurines, from the vanished journal to Philip's habitual attention to symmetry, fit into a coherent whole. The crimes were not chaotic, they were deliberate, methodical, and personal, reflecting a mind capable of anticipating observation and shaping perception. With the pattern finally clear, Miss Marple turned her attention to predicting the next move. The criminal's methodical nature suggested that they would continue to operate within the constraints of their pattern, exploiting symmetry, opportunity, and distraction while attempting to remain unobserved. By identifying the underlying logic, the obsession with order, the deliberate choreography, the use of subtle misdirection, Miss Marple could anticipate future actions and position herself to intercept the perpetrator. She called Inspector Grayson quietly into the drawing room, gesturing toward her diagrams and notes. "Inspector, the chaos you have witnessed is not random," she explained. "Each detail, the placement of objects, the vanished journal, the subtleties of behavior, is part of a consistent pattern. The criminal is guided by an obsession with order and control, one that has dictated both murders and the manipulation of evidence. By understanding this pattern, we can anticipate their next move, constrain their opportunities, and finally reveal the truth." Grayson examined the notes, initially skeptical, then attentive as Miss Marple walked him through the sequence of actions, placements, and reactions. The logic was undeniable. The criminal had acted within predictable parameters, leaving a trail of subtle clues that only a careful observer could discern. The detective's insight into human nature, combined with her attention to physical detail, had illuminated a pathway to resolution. As night fell, Miss Marple moved through the manor, quietly adjusting objects in subtle ways to test reactions, observing the household for minute changes in behavior, and noting any departures from expected patterns. Philip's movements, tense and cautious, continued to provide insight into his awareness of the unfolding investigation. Clara and Mrs. Withers remained anxious but compliant, and Stokes, while silent, maintained a careful watch. Miss Marple allowed herself a small, knowing smile. The chaos of the past days, the first murder, the journal's disappearance, the second attack, had served as both distraction and clue. Now, with the pattern emerging, the seemingly inconsequential details coalesced into clarity. The key to the case had been in plain sight all along, hidden within minor behaviors, subtle placements, and the deliberate orchestration of space. The solution, long obscured by appearances and misdirection, was finally within reach. She settled in the drawing room, pen in hand, reviewing the emerging pattern once more. Outside, the shadows of Blackwood Manor stretched long and deep, mirroring the hidden designs of the criminal within. Yet for the first time, Miss Marple felt that the endgame was near, that the delicate lattice of deception had a weak point, and that careful observation, patience, and an understanding of human nature would soon reveal the perpetrator in full. The atmosphere in Blackwood Manor had grown taut with anticipation. The second murder and the stolen journal had escalated the stakes, and yet, in the quiet of the evening, Miss Marple felt the first glimmer of clarity. The pattern she had discerned over the past days, subtle manipulations, careful choreography, and the criminal's obsession with order, was only part of the picture. A deeper motive, one far more personal and unexpected, lay beneath the surface. It was hidden, not in wealth, inheritance, or rivalry, but in a shadowed corner of the mind, a long-buried resentment waiting to emerge. Miss Marple spent the early morning hours reviewing her notes once more, tracing the history of the Blackwood family and the household staff. The Colonel's long life had been punctuated by quiet acts of authority, firm discipline, and a meticulous attention to order, qualities that had shaped not only the estate, but the people within it. Philip, the Colonel's nephew, had lived under this shadow, navigating both admiration and suppression, seeking approval, yet constantly aware of comparison. Clara and Mrs. Withers had their own connections, but it was Philip whose subtle behaviours had repeatedly drawn Miss Marple's attention, the careful attention to symmetry, the nervous micro-reactions, and the occasional flicker of impatience or irritation when routines were disrupted. yet motive went beyond simple envy or impatience. Miss Marple turned her attention to the interactions, the slight comments, and the private reflections she had recorded during their conversations. Philip's obsession with control, so evident in his micro-adjustments and defensive reactions, hinted at something deeper, a compulsion that went beyond mere opportunity. He was not motivated simply by inheritance or familial pride, but by a need to assert dominance over a world he had always perceived as imperfect, chaotic, and unyielding. It was during a quiet discussion with Inspector Grayson that Miss Marple began to articulate the emerging revelation. "Inspector, consider the psychology of the perpetrator," she said softly. "We have observed more than actions, we have observed a compulsion. The manipulation of objects, the orchestration of appearances, the careful removal of the journal, all point not merely to criminal intent, but to a deeper desire, to exert control over people, events, and perception itself. The motive is as much psychological as it is practical." Grayson frowned, trying to reconcile the violent acts with the subtler signs. "You mean, it's not just about gaining something tangible, like the estate or money?" "Exactly," Miss Marple replied. "The criminal's satisfaction comes from structuring chaos, bending reality to their design, and observing the results. The murders, the theft of the journal, the staging of evidence, all are expressions of a compulsive need for order, a way to dominate not just objects, but the minds of those around them." As she spoke, she recalled a minor incident from the first day of observation, a casual remark by Philip about the rightness of the arrangement of books, the angle of a picture frame, or the alignment of a carpet edge. At the time, it seemed a trivial habit, a mere quirk. Now, Miss Marple saw it in a new light. These minor compulsions had informed his actions, shaping the way he executed both murders and orchestrated deception. The obsession had escalated into something dangerous, deadly even, when combined with opportunity and motive. Miss Marple decided it was time to confront the situation more directly, though carefully. She invited Philip into the drawing room under the pretense of reviewing some minor arrangements in the library. He arrived with polite composure, but Miss Marple immediately noticed the subtle tension in his posture, the same tension she had seen during the hypothetical exercises, the search for the missing journal, and the second murder scenario. "I've been reviewing the sequence of events," she began softly, "and I cannot help but notice a pattern in the placement of objects and the timing of certain actions. The changes are subtle, yet deliberate. I wonder, Philip, if you might shed some light on them. After all, someone so attentive to symmetry and order must have an understanding of what might appear out of place to others." Philip's eyes narrowed slightly, his careful composure shifting into a more guarded stance. I cannot say," he replied, his voice steady but tinged with a faint edge of irritation. "I have been focused on observing, nothing more. Any pattern you see is coincidental." Miss Marple allowed a brief pause, then continued gently. "Coincidence, perhaps, but patterns rarely form by accident, especially when objects and actions appear orchestrated across time and space. The first murder, the missing journal, and the second attack, someone had to understand the household intimately, anticipate reactions, and manipulate both people and events." Philip's hands clenched slightly at his sides, and Miss Marple noted the faint quiver of his lips. "Are you suggesting—" he began, but stopped, as though reconsidering his words. "Yes," Miss Marple said softly, leaning forward. "I'm suggesting that the motive is not merely financial or personal in the traditional sense. It is psychological. You have acted to impose order, to orchestrate events according to your vision, and to observe the results. It is a compulsion, an obsession, expressed through extreme measures. The murders, the theft, and the manipulations are all part of a deeper need to control, to dominate, and to impose perfection on a world you see as flawed." Philip's face blanched, a flicker of recognition, or perhaps horror, passing through his features. For a moment, the carefully cultivated facade of calm and control wavered. Miss Marple observed the micro-expressions she had noted before, tightened jaw, averted gaze, and subtle tremor of the hands. His obsession with order, long hidden beneath politeness and discipline, had been laid bare. I did what I thought necessary," he muttered finally, voice low and strained. The estate, the household, it was always imperfect. Everything was always slightly wrong. I only wanted to fix it, to make it right, to show that things could be ordered. Miss Marple nodded gently, her keen eyes taking in every nuance. And the means you chose, violent, manipulative, and cunning, were guided by that obsession. You saw the world as flawed, and in seeking to correct it, you allowed your compulsion to justify acts no one could foresee. The murders were not merely crimes, they were expressions of an internal need to impose structure on chaos. Philip sank into a chair, the mask of composure shattered, revealing a mind long consumed by obsessive patterns and the relentless desire for control. "I did not mean to hurt anyone," he whispered. "I only wanted things to be right." Miss Marple leaned back, allowing the confession to settle. Intentions, no matter how personal or psychological, do not excuse harm, but understanding the motive allows us to see the pattern clearly. Your compulsion dictated not only your actions but your manipulations, your theft of the journal, and your orchestration of events to mislead others. The psychological need for order was the force behind every act. The revelation changed the dynamic of the investigation. The criminal was not simply motivated by greed or revenge, but by an intense psychological drive, an obsession that had escalated to murder and manipulation. Miss Marple's careful observations, her attention to subtle cues, and her understanding of human nature had illuminated this hidden motive, exposing a dangerous mind willing to go to extremes in pursuit of an internal vision of perfection. Inspector Grayson stepped forward, his expression serious. "Then it is clear. We must secure him immediately before further harm occurs." Miss Marple, calm as ever, simply nodded. The truth, long obscured by layers of misdirection, misplacement, and subtle manipulation, had finally emerged. The hidden motive, more shocking than mere ambition or envy, had guided every action and every choice. In the quiet of the drawing room, the household began to understand the depth of the obsession that had led to tragedy, and the careful work of observation, insight, and psychological deduction had brought it to light. Philip remained seated, quiet and withdrawn, his inner compulsion revealed and rendered powerless before the clarity of understanding. Miss Marple's keen mind had unveiled not only the method of the crimes, but the very reason they had been committed, and the shocking revelation of the hidden motive left no room for doubt. This had been a crime of the mind as much as of opportunity, and only the patient, observant, and insightful could have uncovered it. Miss Marple had spent the morning arranging the final stage of her plan, the culmination of days of careful observation, deduction, and psychological insight. The pattern of the crimes, the hidden motive, and the subtle manipulations of the household were all clear to her now. What remained was to confront Philip, the man whose obsession with order had driven him to murder and manipulation, and to see whether the carefully constructed web of his actions could finally be unravelled. The drawing room was quiet. The household assembled under the pretense of a routine discussion about estate affairs. Clara sat near the window, her hands clasped tightly, while Mrs. Withers hovered with protective concern. Stokes stood near the door, silent and alert. Inspector Grayson, aware that the moment of revelation had arrived, maintained a careful distance, allowing Miss Marple to conduct her confrontation. The tension in the room was palpable, each subtle movement amplified by the knowledge that the criminal remained among them. Miss Marple's gaze met Philip's across the room. He had attempted to maintain a semblance of composure, but the strain was evident, the slight tightness of his jaw, the restless flick of his eyes, the way his fingers tapped almost imperceptibly against the arm of his chair. She approached slowly, her movements deliberate, measured, allowing her presence to convey calm authority. "Philip," she began softly, her voice carrying both firmness and gentleness, "we have spent several days observing the events that have shaken this household. Every detail, from the first murder to the disappearance of the Colonel's journal, has been scrutinized carefully. Patterns emerge, motives are revealed, and subtle cues betray even the most cautious mind." Philip's lips pressed into a thin line. He said nothing, though his body stiffened, betraying the mental calculation already underway. Miss Marple continued, letting her words carry the weight of certainty. The murders, the theft, the manipulations, all of it aligns with one understanding, she said. You, Philip, have orchestrated these events, guided by an obsession not with wealth or inheritance, but with order itself. Every action you took was calculated, every movement deliberate, and every object positioned to reflect your vision of perfection. His eyes flickered briefly toward the window, as if seeking an escape that did not exist. A small, involuntary shiver passed through his shoulders. Miss Marple waited, her gaze unwavering. You believed that, by controlling these events, by imposing your sense of symmetry and rightness, you could correct what you saw as flaws in the household and the estate, she continued. But in doing so, you allowed your compulsion to justify acts that harmed and ultimately destroyed lives. The obsession has been revealed, Philip, and the evidence is clear. Philip rose abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. I only wanted to fix things. Everything was always wrong. I didn't mean to... His voice cracked, and the carefully maintained control he had exercised over his composure began to collapse. Miss Marple's tone remained calm, yet firm. Intentions do not absolve actions, Philip. The pattern of your behaviour, the orchestration of evidence, and the manipulations you have enacted all point to one truth. You are responsible. There is no further need for denial. For a moment, he seemed poised between collapse and desperation. Then, in a sudden, impulsive motion, he lunged toward the fireplace, reaching for the small letter opener Miss Marple had deliberately left as a test the night before. The movement was swift, but her anticipation was quicker. With a gentle yet firm motion, she sidestepped him and pressed a hand against his chest, using the leverage of calm certainty to halt his momentum. "Philip," she said softly, "there is no need for further violence. You are observed, understood, and contained. The household is secure, and your actions have no room to continue. You will not harm another soul." His eyes, wide and frantic, darted across the room, calculating, seeking a window, a passage, any means of escape. The patterns he had relied upon, the familiar angles of furniture, the predictable behaviours of the household, the manipulation of perception, offered him no advantage now. Miss Marple's understanding of his methods had anticipated every possibility. Inspector Grayson stepped forward, quickly but without haste, placing a hand on Philip's arm. "Stay where you are," he instructed firmly, his voice carrying the authority of the law. Stokes moved to assist, positioning himself to prevent flight without provoking panic. Philip sagged slightly, his shoulders dropping in defeat. Miss Marple's calm observation held him, her composed presence serving as both shield and mirror. She spoke again, gently, guiding him toward acknowledgement. "The pattern is complete, Philip. The evidence, the motive, and the method have been revealed. Your compulsion drove your actions, and the consequences are now clear. Confess, and the burden will be lifted. Denial serves no purpose." For a long moment he remained silent, the weight of her insight pressing upon him. Then at last he spoke in a low, almost broken tone. It was never about money, or revenge. I only wanted things to be right, to make everything perfect. I didn't know how else to control it all." Miss Marple nodded, acknowledging the confession without judgment, merely recognition. "We understand, Philip. The motive is clear. Your obsession with order dictated your choices, but now, with the truth revealed, further harm can be prevented. The household is safe, and justice can follow." Philip's collapse into the chair was final, the last vestiges of pretense gone. The patterns, the subtle choreography of manipulation, the psychological compulsion, all had been anticipated, observed, and addressed. Miss Marple had laid a trap not of physical restraint, but of understanding, insight, and patient deduction. Every move Philip had made, every attempt to manipulate or mislead, had been predicted and accounted for. As the household exhaled collectively, relief washing over faces tense for days, Miss Marple allowed herself a brief moment of reflection. The final confrontation had revealed the culmination of careful observation, pattern recognition, and psychological insight. The criminal had been clever, calculating, and dangerously obsessive, yet the patience and composure of a keen mind had outmatched even the most meticulous manipulations. Inspector Grayson secured Philip while Miss Marple quietly reviewed the details once more. The 2 murders, the vanished journal, the subtle placements, and the manipulations of perception all had served as a prelude to this moment. The criminal's obsession had been exposed, the pattern dismantled, and the household safe once more. In the quiet of the drawing room, Miss Marple reflected that the resolution had been achieved not through force, but through understanding. The final confrontation had demanded anticipation, insight, and calm, qualities that allowed the subtle threads of human behavior and deliberate action to be woven into a complete picture. The truth, finally revealed, brought clarity to the chaos, and in the measured stillness of Blackwood Manor, justice had quietly been restored. The house settled into an uneasy calm after Philip's confession. Blackwood Manor, once alive with tension and fear, seemed almost serene in the late afternoon light. Clara moved about quietly, helping Mrs. Withers with minor tasks, while Stokes maintained his silent vigil. Inspector Grayson had begun formal procedures, preparing to take Philip into custody and documenting the sequence of events that had unravelled the mystery. Even Miss Marple allowed herself a brief respite, satisfied that the immediate danger had passed, or so it seemed. As she reviewed her notes in the library, a faint, almost imperceptible sound drew her attention, a soft shuffle from the hallway outside. It was subtle, easily overlooked, but Miss Marple's practised ears picked it up immediately. The manor had been quiet for hours. No one was expected in that corridor. She rose quietly and moved toward the source, her mind alert, noting every detail. The echo of footsteps, the slight draught from a half-open window, the faint glimmer of light reflecting off polished surfaces. At the end of the hallway she found Clara, frowning, holding a small folded piece of paper. I found this tucked behind one of the bookshelves in the library," she said, her voice uncertain. "It wasn't there before, I swear." Miss Marple took the paper, unfolding it carefully. The handwriting was elegant, precise, yet unfamiliar. The note contained a single line. "You've solved the obvious, but not the truth. Watch closely, or it will be lost again." Her mind raced. Philip's confession had seemed final, logical, and sufficient, yet this note suggested another layer, a presence previously unnoticed. Someone else had been manipulating events, observing the investigation, and leaving subtle guidance, or perhaps taunts, for anyone perceptive enough to notice. The question was no longer just about motive or method, it was about identity. Miss Marple summoned Inspector Grayson quietly. "Inspector," she said, her tone calm but serious, "I believe we have overlooked an additional player in this sequence of events. Philip's obsession with order and control explains much, but someone else has been guiding, influencing, or at the very least observing, and possibly orchestrating the entire progression of the investigation. We need to consider who had access, knowledge, and opportunity, and who may have benefited from Philip's actions." Grayson looked sceptical. "You mean another criminal, after everything we've unravelled?" "Yes," Miss Marple said gently, "though criminal may not be entirely accurate. This person's motives are more subtle, manipulation rather than direct action, guiding events so that Philip would act in ways that revealed both himself and the deeper truths of the household." Her attention returned to the note. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the placement suggested intimate knowledge of the library, Philip's routines and the movements of others. Only someone who had observed the household closely without drawing attention could have inserted it so seamlessly. Her mind sifted through the possibilities. Clara, Mrs. Withers, even Stokes, though each seemed unlikely at first glance. The true mastermind was someone overlooked, quiet, and unassuming, the sort of person whose presence was felt only in fleeting, almost imperceptible ways. Miss Marple asked Clara to recount any unusual observations over the past few days. Clara hesitated, then mentioned that she had seen Stokes near the library at odd hours, not performing his usual duties, and that he had seemed unusually attentive to the positions of objects and the flow of people through the halls. On its own, this could have been a minor observation, easily dismissed, but paired with the note and the emerging suspicion, it suggested a far more deliberate involvement. Miss Marple requested that the household remain where they were while she quietly observed. She watched Philip carefully, noting the residual tension in his shoulders, the lingering defensiveness in his posture, and the subtle way he avoided the library corner where the note had been discovered. He seemed unaware of the new development, yet his reactions, though subtle, indicated a lingering fear or unease, a sense that the web of observation extended beyond him. Then she turned her attention to Stokes. The man had been a model of discretion and silence, attentive without intrusion. But now, under subtle scrutiny, minor patterns emerged. The way he had moved furniture slightly during Philip's exercises, the quiet adjustments to objects when no one was looking, and his presence at key locations without obvious purpose. The realization settled over Miss Marple like a cool breeze. Stokes had been both observer and guide, carefully orchestrating situations to provoke Philip, revealing the obsessive patterns, and testing the household's responses without ever drawing suspicion to himself. Miss Marple acted deliberately. She called Stokes to the library under the pretense of reviewing security measures and quietly observed his reactions. His face, composed as ever, showed the faintest hesitation, a micro-expression that betrayed awareness beyond what a servant should reasonably possess. He did not speak, yet the tension in his posture, the subtle sharpening of his gaze, and the slight tightening of his jaw spoke volumes. "Stokes," she said calmly, "we have reviewed the events of the past days, the murders, and the manipulations of objects and perception. It seems you were present for much of this, often in places and at times that coincided with key actions. Do you wish to explain?" Stokes remained silent for a moment, the quiet authority of the library pressing upon him. Then, in a low, measured tone, he began to speak. "I observed. I did not commit the acts, but I guided, subtly. Mr. Phillip's compulsion was obvious to me early on, and I saw that it could lead to further harm if left unchecked. I merely set conditions, left cues, and observed reactions to ensure that the pattern would emerge, that the truth would be revealed." Miss Marple nodded slowly, understanding the full scope of the final twist. Philip had been the actor, driven by obsession and compulsion, but Stokes had been the silent architect of revelation, the unseen hand ensuring that the pattern would emerge in a way that allowed for understanding and resolution. The mastermind, it turned out, was not the murderer, but the one who had guided discovery, someone whose influence had been hidden beneath the appearance of service and discretion. Inspector Grayson looked astonished. "So, he's been orchestrating the investigation itself?" "Precisely," Miss Marple said, her gaze steady. "Without his subtle guidance, the pattern may never have been discerned, the motive might have remained obscured, and Philip's compulsion could have continued unchecked. The final revelation was not an act of malice, but an intervention designed to ensure that the truth and justice would emerge." Philip, still seated and tense, looked from Miss Marple to Stokes and back again, a dawning realization spreading across his features. His obsession, though destructive, had been revealed not only by his own actions but by the quiet manipulations of someone he had underestimated completely. He understood now that the final twist was not simply a revelation of motive, but an exposure of his own vulnerability and the depth of perception possessed by those he had dismissed. Miss Marple allowed the moment to settle, her calm observation encompassing the room. The mystery was complete, yet its resolution was layered. The crimes, the obsession, the hidden manipulations, and the final guiding hand of a subtle and perceptive mind. The genius of the detective had been tested one last time, not only in deciphering the pattern and motive, but in recognizing the unseen influence that had directed events toward clarity. As the household exhaled collectively, relief mingled with awe. The murderer's compulsion had been revealed and contained. The manipulations, once hidden, were understood, and the true architect of the final revelation had been identified. Miss Marple's insight had illuminated not only the criminal mind, but the silent guidance that ensured the emergence of truth. In the quiet that followed, she reflected on the nature of observation, influence, and human psychology. Sometimes the final twist is not in the act of crime itself, but in the subtle orchestration of events, the unseen hand that shapes outcomes without leaving overt traces. Blackwood Manor, long a stage for obsession, manipulation, and hidden motives, now rested in calm, its secrets exposed and its lessons clear. In the end, perception, patience, and insight revealed all. The late afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows of Blackwood Manor, casting long, dappled shadows across the polished floors. The household had gathered in the drawing-room once again, tension mingling with an uneasy relief. Philip, now restrained and under formal custody, had been subdued, his obsessive compulsions curtailed by circumstance. Stokes, the silent orchestrator of revelation, remained near the doorway, his posture calm yet attentive, eyes reflecting both the satisfaction of his subtle guidance and the weight of his complicity in directing events toward clarity. Miss Marple stood at the centre of the room, her notebook open, her gaze sweeping across each face. It was a rare moment of calm in the aftermath of chaos, yet she felt the lingering pulse of unresolved threads. Even with Philip's confession and Stokes' revelation, the household remained unsettled, as if the manor itself were aware that justice, though served, had required layers of subtle manoeuvring to achieve. "Inspector Grayson," she began, her voice steady, "the events we have observed over the past days form a narrative far more complex than a single murder or a single motive. It is vital, for clarity and closure, to recount the details that led us to this point, to illuminate the path that, at first, seemed obscured." Grayson nodded, attentive, knowing that Miss Marple's explanations always revealed the overlooked subtleties others failed to notice. "Please, go ahead," he said. Miss Marple gestured toward the centre of the room, where the traces of Philip's compulsions could still be discerned in the alignment of furniture, the minor adjustments of objects, and the faint smudge of past misdirection. The first murder, the placement of the ace of spades near Colonel Blackwood's desk, appeared to many either theatrical or arbitrary, yet the angle of placement, the slight tilt toward the desk edge, corresponded with Philip's obsessive attention to alignment and symmetry. It was a signal of intent, but one subtle enough to be overlooked by the casual observer. Clara shifted slightly, listening with wide eyes while Mrs. Withers held her hands together tightly, as if bracing for a revelation too long anticipated. "The second murder, staged to appear haphazard," Miss Marple continued, "was in reality a continuation of this pattern. Objects were moved, evidence was erased or disguised, all in accordance with Philip's compulsive drive to impose order. The disappearance of the journal was similarly orchestrated, not merely to conceal information, but to test reactions and measure responses. Each act, though seemingly isolated, was part of a coherent design dictated by obsession." She paused, allowing the information to sink in. Then her gaze turned subtly towards Stokes. And yet, the crucial twist, the one that ensured discovery and prevented further harm, was the silent guidance of Mr. Stokes. His interventions were so minimal, so unobtrusive, that they escaped notice. Yet they were instrumental. The careful placement of minor objects, the allowance of opportunities for observation, and even the subtle provocations that revealed Philip's compulsions. Without these interventions, the pattern may have remained hidden, and the compulsion unchecked. Grayson raised an eyebrow. So, the true mastermind wasn't Philip, but the one ensuring that the pattern came to light. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "Philip was the actor, but the revelation required a mind capable of observing both him and the household, understanding human behaviour, and orchestrating circumstances to allow the truth to emerge. Stokes fulfilled that role, quietly, without overt interference, guiding events with discretion and insight." A hush fell over the room. The household absorbed the intricacy of what had occurred, a crime driven by compulsion, a confession born of obsession, and a hidden hand that ensured discovery without direct involvement. Even those who had been fearful now seemed to grasp the depth of the interplay between intent and intervention. Miss Marple continued, her voice calm but compelling. "Observe, if you will, the minor clues that went unnoticed initially. The slight smudge on the fireplace hearth, the angle of the candlestick on the mantelpiece, the timing of Philip's movements relative to the household routines. Each was a testament to his compulsions. Each, when considered collectively, formed a pattern, one that required both careful attention and psychological insight to decode. Clara's hands trembled slightly as she asked, "Miss Marple, does this mean everything is over? Will Philip be held accountable?" Miss Marple nodded. Indeed, Philip's actions constitute clear evidence, his confessions, corroborated by the physical pattern and behavioural observations. Justice, in the formal sense, will be delivered. Yet, it is important to remember that justice, in its strictest sense, does not always resolve the deeper currents of human behaviour. Obsessions, compulsions, and hidden motives often linger in the shadows, influencing lives long after a crime has been revealed. She turned her attention back to the group. The lesson, perhaps, is the value of careful observation. It is not always the most dramatic evidence that reveals truth, but the subtle, overlooked details, small gestures, micro-expressions, objects out of place, that provide insight. Patience, attentiveness, and understanding human nature allowed the resolution of this case. Without such attention, Philip's obsession might have remained unchecked, and the household could have faced further tragedy. Inspector Grayson, absorbing the explanation, added, "Your method of deduction, Miss Marple, is unparalleled. Even when the obvious seemed to point conclusively in one direction, you discerned the subtleties, the hidden influences, and the true nature of the criminal mind." Miss Marple allowed a faint smile, modest yet knowing. It is not genius, merely attention and patience. Every person, every action leaves traces, some subtle, some nearly invisible. The challenge is noticing them, interpreting them correctly, and following the thread to its conclusion. Yet even as calm seemed to settle over Blackwood Manor, an unsettling awareness remained. Philip had been restrained, his compulsions understood, his guilt established. Stokes had revealed his subtle role, ensuring the pattern's revelation. But Miss Marple's eyes, keen as ever, noted the lingering tension in the corners of the room, the quiet watchfulness of servants, the subtle fidget of household members, the faint, almost imperceptible movements that hinted at lingering uncertainty. Human behaviour is never fully constrained, and obsessions, while understood, may leave echoes. She allowed herself a final, measured glance at the household. "Justice has been served," she said quietly, though, as always, human nature leaves room for caution. The truths we uncover may prevent immediate harm, but the patterns of thought, the impulses, and the obsessions, these linger, reminding us that vigilance and understanding are never complete. Inspector Grayson finally exhaled, his shoulders relaxing. Then Blackwood Manor can finally breathe. "And we owe much to your insight, Miss Marple." She inclined her head gently. "Insight is only meaningful when combined with patience and observation. The criminal left clues, often subtle and nearly invisible. Those who missed them were misled, not through negligence, but by the deceptive simplicity of appearances. Yet, when one observes with care, even the most intricate manipulations are revealed. That is why, as ever, the truth prevails for those who are attentive enough to notice it." The household began to disperse, carrying with them the uneasy relief of knowledge tempered by the understanding of human complexity. Miss Marple lingered for a moment, reviewing her notes one last time. Each subtle clue, each overlooked detail, each hidden motivation had been accounted for, and yet she knew that human nature is rarely fully tamed. Justice, in its formal sense, had been delivered, but the echoes of obsession, subtle manipulation, and compulsion remained, a reminder that the mind's shadows are never completely illuminated. In the quiet of the drawing room, Miss Marple reflected on the case, a compulsion-driven murderer, a silent orchestrator of revelation, and a household caught in the intricate dance of perception and deception. The case was resolved, justice was secured, and yet the subtle, unsettling knowledge remained that human nature, in all its complexity, never truly rests. And for those who observe carefully, the lessons linger, ready to reveal themselves once more when the next shadow falls. The evening sun had begun to sink behind the trees surrounding Blackwood Manor. casting long, golden shafts of light through the tall windows. The household had settled into a cautious, uneasy calm. Philip was securely in custody, awaiting transfer, and Stokes remained quietly at his post, his role as silent orchestrator recognised, his subtle interventions acknowledged yet unspoken in detail to the wider household. The tension that had gripped the manor for days had finally dissipated, replaced by a tentative relief. Miss Marple lingered in the drawing-room, watching the last of the servants retreat to their quarters and listening to the faint rustle of the trees outside. Her mind, ever vigilant, was still processing the intricate sequence of events, the delicate interplay of motive, compulsion and guidance that had brought the case to its resolution. Though justice had been formally served, her instincts whispered that a story rarely closes so neatly. As she turned to leave the room, her eyes caught a small, almost inconsequential object on the windowsill, a finely folded piece of parchment, yellowed and faintly frayed at the edges. It had gone unnoticed in the bustle of events, and yet its presence now seemed deliberate, almost like a whisper left behind for someone observant enough to notice. She picked it up carefully, unfolding it with measured precision. The writing was elegant, but different from the note Stokes had left. It read, "The end is never as it seems. The next revelation lies where shadows gather and the unseen watches." Miss Marple's brow furrowed slightly. The message was cryptic, but her instincts told her it was no idle warning. It hinted at observation, secrecy, and perhaps a thread that had yet to be followed. She had already navigated the obsessions of Philip, the subtle orchestration of Stokes, and the pattern of crimes and misdirections that had unfolded. And yet this note suggested that the tapestry was not yet complete, that another layer of intrigue might exist, quietly waiting to reveal itself. She walked slowly toward the front door, her mind reviewing the day's events one last time. The murders had been driven by obsession, carefully concealed beneath layers of meticulous action. Philip's compulsions had dictated his behaviour, guiding him to acts of violence he had justified to himself as necessary corrections of imperfection. Stokes had acted as an invisible architect, ensuring that the truth would emerge without drawing suspicion to himself, guiding events so subtly that no one could see the pattern until it was fully revealed. And yet, this note suggested a different possibility. Someone, perhaps a new presence or someone overlooked, might still be observing, waiting to see how the revelations played out. Miss Marple's eyes scanned the room, noting the shadowed corners, the soft reflections of sunlight on glass surfaces, and the faint outlines of furniture. She imagined the hidden angles from which an observer might watch, the silent spaces where one could remain unnoticed, the subtle influence a quiet presence could exert. Her thoughts turned to the minor details she had catalogued over the past days, the way certain objects had been shifted slightly when no one was looking, the pattern of footsteps in the hallways, the small, almost imperceptible inconsistencies in timing and placement. Each had contributed to understanding Philip's compulsion and Stokes' interventions, yet a small fraction had always seemed slightly off, a hint of deviation from the expected sequence. Perhaps these were nothing, minor artifacts of human activity, but the note now suggested they might be intentional, deliberate, and waiting to be deciphered. Miss Marple's gaze fell upon the grand staircase, noting a faint smudge along the polished railing that she hadn't noticed before. It was slight, almost indistinguishable from ordinary wear, yet in her mind it formed a connection to the cryptic message. Someone had been there, perhaps even recently. Someone had observed, perhaps learning from the prior events, and had left a hint for the perceptive. She considered the possibilities. Was this a warning, a challenge, a simple message of intrigue? The ambiguity thrilled her mind, as it always did, and yet she knew her role was to remain vigilant, to note and to observe, and to allow the puzzle to reveal itself in its own time. Every mystery, no matter how seemingly resolved, carried shadows and hints of the unknown. Even as the household felt a tentative sense of closure, she understood that the threads of observation, deception, and human behaviour rarely ended neatly. Miss Marple stepped outside, letting the cool evening air brush against her face. The grounds were quiet, the trees swaying softly, the distant calls of birds settling for the night. In that quiet she allowed herself to reflect on the patterns she had discerned, the subtleties others had missed, and the intricate dance of psychology, manipulation, and intuition that had brought the case to its formal conclusion. Yet, in the back of her mind, the note's words lingered. The end is never as it seems. She smiled faintly, recognizing the familiar thrill of anticipation that accompanied every mystery. There was satisfaction in resolution, certainly, but a detective's mind never rests entirely. The next clue, the next shadow, the next puzzle. These were always waiting, quietly observing, ready to reveal themselves to those prepared to notice. She walked down the gravel path toward the gate, her eyes scanning the horizon, noting the subtle shifts of light and shadow, the distant shapes of trees, the quiet angles of the estate's architecture. Every detail mattered. Every nuance could contain a hint, a message, or a new challenge. Miss Marple knew that, while this particular case had been unravelled, human behaviour, obsession, and subtle manipulation were endless sources of intrigue. A gentle breeze stirred, carrying with it the faint scent of earth and leaves. She paused, considering the finality of the day's events. Justice had been delivered, the pattern had been exposed, and the hidden motives revealed. Yet the cryptic message, the faint smudge, and the lingering awareness of unseen observation reminded her that the world is never as simple as it seems. Even in the quietest households, even in the most careful observations, mysteries remain, waiting to be discovered. With a last glance at Blackwood Manor, Miss Marple adjusted her hat and began walking toward the carriage that would take her to the next destination. Her mind, alert and lively as ever, traced the subtle cues, the unnoticed patterns, and the faint suggestions that hinted at something beyond the visible. There would be more mysteries, of course, for those patient and observant enough to notice them. And so she departed, leaving behind the manor, the restrained criminal, and the household slowly reclaiming normalcy. Yet, as the evening shadows lengthened, she could not shake the sense that the story was not fully complete. Somewhere, perhaps hidden in plain sight, or quietly orchestrated by an unseen hand, another puzzle awaited, a lingering question, a subtle message, a mystery that would demand the same careful observation, insight, and patience she had always brought to every case. Miss Marple smiled to herself. The world of human behaviour and hidden motives is inexhaustible. Every resolved case is merely the prelude to the next, and for those who observe, the game never truly ends.